Chapter 449. Yun Yang inched forward as carefully as he could, trying his best to conform to the nature of the breeze that he was currently in. His body and mind were fully immersed in the nature of heaven and earth, drifting forward as gently as he could. Anyone or anything that came into contact with Yun Yang at such a close or even negative distance would not feel anything out of the ordinary. The breeze that brushed past could be felt but left no trace. That was how it should be. Therefore Yun Yang thought that he should be in a state of divine distance. Then there was no more movement below and the other party was nowhere to be seen. It was not as thorough as Yun Yang. Whether it was the person, the sword, the aura, the deific consciousness or even the attack, it was as if they did not exist at all. Only the instinctive sense of danger that originated from a cultivator was still present. Yun Yang knew that the crisis was far from over. The quieter it was now, the more dangerous it was. If he were to let his guard down for even a moment, it would be the moment of his demise. Maintaining the state of divine distance, he drifted forward for about a dozen miles. Suddenly Yun Yang felt like he had bumped into something. Perhaps he had come into contact with something unusual. It was as if there was an invisible barrier that connected heaven and earth, blocking him within a certain range. He had come into contact with the edge of that range and thus he had touched it. The moment Yun Yang came into contact with the barrier, he knew that something was amiss. He immediately turned into a stream of wind with a swoosh, the manifestation of the wind retreating 1,000 feet away. Almost at the same time as Yun Yang moved, another bizarre sword light appeared out of nowhere, slicing the space that he had come into contact with into pieces. Everything in that space was annihilated at once. Shockingly, a black hole was slowly repairing itself. Yun Yang let out another soft grunt in his heart. Although he had reacted in time and dispersed swiftly, he could not help but be slightly affected by the sword energy, causing his soul to feel waves of excruciating pain that felt like it was being sliced apart. At the same time, his mind was filled with a hazy feeling. His internal organs were churning as well as if they were on fire. The damage caused to him by this sword was much more intense than the previous one. His body, mind, divine sense, and divine soul had all been attacked. Yun Yang even suspected that the strange sword energy was designed to target his manifestation. It was not aimed at the physical body but only at the soul, causing the soul to backfire on his body and mind and even indirectly injure his physical body. Such power was truly terrifying. Yun Yang's alarmed heart had been raised to another level. The sword light seemed to have succeeded, but it also seemed to have failed. It didn't linger on the spot, but disappeared again as if it didn't exist. It was as if it had melted into the air. From beginning to end, no one could see where it came from or where it was going. This scene was extremely strange and indescribable. The sense of danger that Yun Yang felt grew stronger than before. Yun Yang climbed swiftly. He was at least 10,000 feet above the ground, but even at such a high altitude, he could still clearly feel the sense of danger following him like a parasite. Even if it was only for a moment, it did not leave him. Yun Yang grumbled inwardly. Yun Yang had never been someone who would give up easily. Otherwise, he would not have taken the risk to go there despite knowing that there was a spiritual restraining formation in Zilong City. He would not have chosen to bluff and threaten Zio's emperor and officials to take back the Niello Bear's mystical core despite knowing the limits of his ability. There were too many similar examples. However, Yun Yang really did not know how to deal with it now. The ability of this person who was lurking in the dark before him was not something that he could fight against. To Yun Yang's knowledge, his strength was even more powerful than Ling Xiaozui's back then. Could it be that Mr. Nian had come personally? However, how could Mr. Nian be so strong? What kind of standard was this? Could it be that his estimation of Ling Xiaozui's ability had been wrong? Should be so. It was just like how he had thought that Old Bai was very strong, but Old Bai, who was already at the 6th level of Heaven Realm, was still no match for Jun Moyan's sword. It seemed that ignorance was bliss. Just as Yun Yang's thoughts were drifting, the strange sword light attacked again. Just like before, it flashed by and didn't stop. Then it disappeared. Once again Yun Yang felt that his divine soul was affected. Yun Yang made a quick calculation. The other party seemed to have used some unknown method to know that he was within this space. Now the other party's sword force had completely locked down a radius of about 50,000 feet. This was undoubtedly a vast area. However, the other party's sword, speed, and force could ignore the distance between them. It could appear wherever it wanted to. If he continued to stay here, he might be killed by the other party in the next moment. There was no chance of luck in this. Even if he could transform into thousands of clones with the other party's skill, if 10 strikes were not enough, 100 strikes would not be enough. Under the continuous attacks, he could always be fatally wounded. Finally, he could no longer maintain his wind manifestation. It was Yun Yang's first time encountering such a situation. Despite the fear in his heart, he could not just sit and wait to be captured. Thus, he began to think anxiously about how he could escape and get himself out of this dangerous situation. Right now, the most critical thing was still the geographical advantage. The other party had set up a strange barrier to restrict him within a certain area. He had to change this flaw to improve the current situation, but how could he do it? The wind was flowing towards the northeast now. If he changed the direction of the wind abruptly, there would definitely be an anomaly. The moment he changed, he might be caught and killed by the other party. If he turned into a cloud and left, it would most likely be the same. Blood, water, fire? These few aspects would not do. None of them would do. There was also the lightning manifestation. The speed of the lightning manifestation was indeed faster than the wind, but the consumption was too intense and the target was obvious. Even if he really turned into lightning, he would still be killed by the other party with a snap of his fingers. Helpless, Yun Yang could only maintain his slow drifting trajectory, drifting towards the south. Yun Yang's movement was not without reason. The south was the closest to the ground and the highest spot of the mountain below. The enemy should be right here, riding his sword and pointing it at him. If he drifted north, he could stay away from the enemy, but it would definitely be the direction that the enemy was most concerned about. The more dangerous a place is, the safer it is. Now that I'm at my wit's end, I can only take the risk and do the opposite. Yun Yang continued to move south carefully. This time, he turned himself into thousands of wisps of wind and quietly separated himself from the barrier. Below, the sword light moved again. It flashed like before, and another space that was close to the barrier was instantly torn apart. This time, however, it did not affect Yun Yang at all. The sword light was aimless, and it was the first time Yun Yang was unharmed. However, the sword light did not vanish. Instead, it flashed 3 more times. Thousands of feet of space close to the north were torn into 3 large black holes almost at the same time. If Yun Yang had been within the range of these 3 black holes, even if he did not die, his wind manifestation would dissipate and he would be gravely injured. It could be said that Yun Yang's decision to continue moving thousands of feet to the south in this short period of time was extremely wise. The 3 lightning-fast swords did not cause him any harm. Even so, Yun Yang was still shaken by the swords, shuddering in fear. The astonishing might of these swords, especially when he personally witnessed it, was truly hard to describe the soul-stirring feeling he felt. Yun Yang did not even notice where the sword light came from or where it would eventually return to, even though he was watching from the sidelines. This was simply an inconceivable miracle. With Yun Yang's current cultivation base and the standard of ascending to the heaven realm, although he was still not considered top-notch, the average 10th perfection grandmaster was no longer a match for a single strike of his saber. The battle in Zilong City had already proven this point. In spite of this, he still could not find even the slightest trace of this opponent he was facing now. If Yun Yang's wind manifestation were to be broken, he would probably be dismembered and die in the next instant. His soul would be destroyed as well and he would be doomed eternally. He would be as dead as he could possibly be. After a few futile attacks in the north, the strange sword light suddenly paused for a breath's time, as if it was considering something. With a sudden thought, Yun Yang hurriedly maneuvered his wind manifestation to move to the north once more. His current position was where the void had been torn apart by the 3 consecutive slashes just now. Sure enough, as soon as he started to move, the strange and inexplicable sword light with terrifying destructive power flashed several times from the north to the south in the space of thousands of feet. It was obvious that Yun Yang's guess was right. The owner of the sword light had predicted Yun Yang's thoughts and countermeasure after his consecutive attacks failed, so he struck again without hesitation. If Yun Yang had been slightly slower, he would not have been able to avoid the series of attacks. While Yun Yang was still terrified, a sliver of delight rose in his heart. He had seen a turning point, or rather, the key to the outcome of this battle. Mr. Nian's wisdom is unparalleled and his strategy is profound. He's obviously confirmed that I'm in this area, so he'll definitely try his best to kill me. He won't miss this golden opportunity. However, it's one thing for him to confirm that I'm here, but it's another matter to lock onto my actual location. His continuous attacks from the north just now were not meant to kill, but to probe. When he noticed that something was amiss, he would definitely clear the area around him. Therefore, the area around him has become the most dangerous place again. Therefore, I've moved to the place where he attacked just now. This is the safest place right now. Yun Yang was thinking nervously. But what will he do after wiping out the south? How should I make use of the fact that he can't pinpoint my actual location? He's probably guessed that I'm hiding at the place where he attacked just now, which is why I'm temporarily safe. Then, after he sweeps through the space from the south to the south, should I continue heading north? Chapter 450. Yun Yang's thoughts spun rapidly. He's already gone from the south to the north, but he didn't find anything. He won't make the same mistake again. He'll only sweep the south again later. Therefore, the place he swept through isn't safe anymore. I can't stay here anymore. Yun Yang steeled his heart. His wind manifestation continued to head north. The sword light flashed once more in the south, flashing a dozen times before it stopped. Yun Yang had already traveled almost 10,000 feet away. Seeing that the other party's attack had stopped, Yun Yang slowed down his movements as well. Looking from afar, the strange sword light continued to wreak havoc just as the movement in the south stopped. The time interval is too short. Mr. Nian is still suspicious of the other side. He's intelligent and adaptable. Yun Yang sighed subconsciously. The current situation was that Yun Yang had a chance to escape. As long as he could get 50,000 feet away from Mr. Nian's sword energy, Yun Yang would be able to escape unscathed. In spite of this, he would never be able to get out of this 50,000 feet radius of sword light in such a short period of time. As long as there was a mistake in judgment, or even if Mr. Nian had hit him by chance, the situation would take a turn for the worse. As for Mr. Nian, after sweeping the south for the second time, he changed the direction of his attack again. Yun Yang guessed that this time, it would be an all-encompassing, indiscriminate attack. There was only one relatively safe place for such a move, the south that Mr. Nian had just swept through twice. Yun Yang moved swiftly, rushing towards the area that was being ravaged by the lingering sword light. This was a battle of wits. Both parties were highly intelligent. The only difference was that if Mr. Nian had guessed wrongly, Yun Yang would have a chance to escape. Still, it was only a chance. If Yun Yang had guessed wrongly, he would be targeted by Mr. Nian's sword light and turned into dust. Yun Yang's bet was his life. He was betting with his very life. On one hand, Yun Yang controlled his deific consciousness subtly and was even more careful in his manifestation to ensure that he did not emit any suspicious aura. On the other hand, he was trying his best to avoid the lingering power of the sword energy. Almost like a moth flying into a flame, he rushed towards the atmosphere that was filled with remnant flames and embers. Furthermore, this wave of actions had to be fast, fast, fast. However, if he was too fast, he would be destroyed by the sword light the moment he crashed into it. If he was too slow, he would be smashed into the sword light net on the spot by Mr. Nian, who had turned around. His grasp of propriety had indeed reached an unimaginable level. On the other side, the lingering sword light was still shining like a silver snake. Yun Yang was already close to the edge of the black hole that had been sliced open by the sword light. It was as if the two of them had an appointment. Yun Yang stepped in and the sword light disappeared. Yun Yang entered the area of the black hole unscathed. The space crackled as it gradually recovered. Yun Yang, who was in the state of a breeze, was inconspicuous. On the other side, the continuous, indiscriminate and bizarre sword light attacks arrived as expected. Mr. Nian struck again. Even for Mr. Nian, this attack should be considered an all-out effort. Yun Yang could acutely sense that this might be his only chance of survival in this battle. It was at this moment that he suddenly changed his direction. Still trying his best not to make any noise, he dived down at full speed. If he were to remain high up in the sky, the other party would be able to force him out sooner or later. The only thing he could do now was to risk landing on the ground and shake off the suppression of the other party's high-altitude territory. Yun Yang plummeted to the ground like a meteor. Behind him, the sword light was still wreaking havoc. The snowflakes and dark clouds that were drifting down from the sky were torn into pieces as the sword light struck from every space. Thousands of sword lights and strands of sword chi were still mixed with long sword lights, and they flickered horizontally and vertically in the air. They rose and fell and they seemed to be endless. Yun Yang was less than 500 feet from the ground when the sword light that was wreaking havoc in the air suddenly stopped. It had stopped without warning. Then the sword light flashed again as it turned around and plunged downwards. With a loud boom, the accumulated thick snow on the ground rose into the air. Every snowflake turned into sharp sword energy with that loud boom. The land within a 10-mile radius was completely sliced apart. The attack was even more ferocious than before. The other party had actually guessed Yun Yang's current plan. Fortunately, Yun Yang had anticipated the change and was prepared for it at the same time. However, when he was personally hit by the wave of attack, Yun Yang still felt that his body was riddled with holes. It was worse than being sliced into pieces. There was no other reason but the attack's range was too wide and the attack was relatively concentrated. Of course, more importantly, Yun Yang was hit by the attack as expected. This was one of the keys to his escape from this battle. Yun Yang forcefully suppressed the urge to faint. As the attack landed quietly on the ground, he activated the holy water charm immediately. Many water droplets seemed to have melted due to the sudden change in the snow on the ground and fell into the layer of snow below. The sword energy in the sky continued to fall towards the forest. Almost every inch of land was flipped over by the continuous sword light. Anything that was hit by the sword light and sword energy, even a snowflake, was shattered into pieces. The trees that were covered in snow seemed to have encountered the greatest calamity in the world. Not a single one of them was spared. None of them were spared. An indifferent voice rang out for the first time. Supreme Cloud, I know you're in this snowfield. Yun Yang was currently under the layer of snow. Although he had seeped into the ground due to his water manifestation, he could still feel new wounds on his body. He held it in forcefully, allowing Emi's spatial spiritual force to replenish and repair his wounds without interruption. He was trying his best to keep himself from fainting due to his poor physical condition. As for the voices from the outside world, he ignored them completely. If he fainted now, everything would be over. You can say whatever you want. Since you're so capable, I'll let you run your mouth. The creaking of the snow outside indicated that someone had landed on the snowy ground and was currently walking over in a slow and graceful manner. The voice was still speaking freely. The voice was elegant and composed, containing an unparalleled authority that controlled the world and a sense of superiority over the common people. It was as if the person who was speaking had the power to decide the life and death of all living beings in this world. You're very smart. Even your spiritual sense is unusually sensitive. You can actually sense the impending danger in advance. This is something I admire very much. As the person spoke, there were still countless sword energy hissing out. Like Yun Yang had predicted, he could not pinpoint Yun Yang's exact location after his manifestation, but his attack range still encompassed Yun Yang. He was certain that Yun Yang's current location was within 50,000 feet of where he stood. Therefore, he had never struck out a single strike beyond this range. It was as if he was certain that this supreme cloud must be within the boundary he had drawn. That elegant voice continued to ring out like two old friends chatting. Such spiritual sense is very precious. In my life, I've seen people with such spiritual sense. If they were martial artists, they would be unparalleled experts. If they were in the military, they would be peerless marshals. If they were in the bureaucracy, they would be famous officials. Such spiritual sense is the most precious gift God has given to mankind. It's irreplaceable. Actually, everyone basically has this kind of spiritual sense. They're born with it. However, looking at the entire world, those who can use this spiritual sense flexibly are definitely not more than 100 people since the beginning of time. As for today's world, they are as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. As for your second strength, it's intelligence. I've rarely seen a young man as intelligent, resourceful, scheming, and shrewd as you. You've done very well indeed. The sword light hissed. Having intelligence doesn't equate to being resourceful. Having intelligence and resourcefulness doesn't equate to being resourceful. Those who have all three may not necessarily be shrewd and scheming, but you have all of these. The Nine Supremes think tank lives up to his reputation. It's commendable that you could capture my people one by one and kill them one by one when you were still weak. However, what I value more is that you've ensured not to expose your true identity throughout the series of actions. Even I have to admit that I admire you for this. If I were in your shoes, I might not have the confidence to do what you've done. You're Supreme Cloud, the Nine Supremes think tank, but you've disguised yourself as Supreme Wind and Supreme Flame, reinvigorating your reputation with wind and fire. You've even hidden your true self in the mist, forsaking your name and disregarding your reputation. This alone isn't something that anyone can do. However, this isn't what I admire the most about you. Just now, we only had a short exchange of blows. Although you didn't see me and I didn't see you, you had an accurate grasp of my mentality. You've been avoiding my blind spots, walking the line between life and death. Not only that, you could even make use of my blind spots to find an opportunity for yourself to escape. The gap between our cultivation bases is as wide as heaven and earth, but you could predict my every step and come to this. How rare. How rare indeed. Supreme Cloud, you're truly a genius. The elegant voice outside sighed, as if it was filled with pity for the Supreme Cloud it spoke of. In spite of this, the hissing sound of sword energy had never stopped throughout his long speech. During this period of time, Yun Yang felt that he had been brushed past by the sword energy at least a dozen times. Yes, it had merely brushed past, but it had already caused more severe damage to Yun Yang. The sword energy's point of origin was his soul. The excruciating pain that came from the soul went straight to the depths of his consciousness. It was more excruciating than an ordinary physical injury, so excruciating that it could not be any more agonizing. If I had a choice, I'd prefer to take you in as my assistant and not kill you. The voice outside sighed in melancholy. It's a pity that I have to kill you. Our standpoints are completely different, creating a deadlock. I wonder if you want to know why I must kill the 9 Supremes? Yun Yang's heart almost stopped beating when the question was tossed out. He almost blurted it out and questioned the person face to face, because this was the biggest mystery in his heart. However, he dared not react at all now. The voice outside continued, the 9 Supremes and I have no enmity in the past or in the present. I've set up layers of traps and ambushed them at Tianshan Cliff, obviously intending to annihilate all of the 9 Supremes. How can there be no reason for this? I guess you must be very confused about this as well? Have you always been confused? The person outside seemed to be talking to himself. However, Yun Yang knew that this was a psychological attack. He was purposely talking about the things he was interested in, with the aim of triggering an unusual fluctuation in his soul. With the other party's profound cultivation base and divine means, as long as Yun Yang made any movement, he would be the first to notice it. By then, there would be no chance of survival and he would die for sure. Yun Yang forcefully suppressed his thoughts, keeping his body still and unmoving. The voice continued elegantly, I know you understand what I mean, but you're obviously someone who knows how to control yourself. You're very rational and know what's the right choice to make, only then will you have a chance of survival. However, this reputed one wants to tell you that it's useless. You must be very curious as to how I can be sure that you're within this area, including when we were high up in the sky just now. It was because I had confirmed your position, that you were within a certain area. That was why I attacked so brazenly and limited the area of my attack. Aren't you curious about this? No matter how you hide, no matter how you compromise, I won't leave until you die. The person outside smiled faintly. As long as you're still alive, I can feel that this battle will not end until one of us dies. I know you're waiting for me to lose my patience, to doubt my own judgment, and to leave in disappointment. However, I want to tell you that your hope will never come true. Even if you don't move for a year, I'll stay here and guard for a year. The elegant voice outside said faintly, without the slightest hint of anger. There was even a hint of a smile in it. If 1 year isn't enough, then 10 years is fine. I can afford it. I really can afford it. So, you have no luck in this battle. Even if you're wise and resourceful, you can't make up for the difference in ability. Supreme Cloud, if you come out now, I'll dispel all the doubts in your heart and let you die without regrets. On the other hand, if you persist in hiding and don't come out, there's only one outcome, to rot here with endless questions and regrets, to be left as a corpse. I believe you know who I am. You're right. The voice outside sneered. I'm the person you want to kill the most, Mr. Nyen of the Four Seasons Tower. Chapter 451. Yun Yang hid under the snow, suppressing his emotions again and again, reminding himself over and over again. Mr. Nyen. The person outside is indeed Mr. Nyen. The person outside is the biggest enemy of my life. No matter what, I have to get through this. I have to survive this battle. I have to hold on until the moment I kill him. Otherwise, I won't be able to rest in peace. Not only will I not be able to rest in peace, but my brothers and my family will die with them as well. If I'm finished and give up, how can this boundless debt of blood and hatred be resolved? No matter how much he angers me, no matter how he provokes me, I have to get through this. I have to get through this. I can't die. I can't die. Yun Yang told himself over and over again. Slowly, his emotions calmed down again. Mr. Nyen, who was outside, did not know that the psychological attack that he thought would work had instead become the source of Yun Yang's composure. This was the so-called self-destruction of one's own actions. The wisdom of a wise man might not always be what he thought. Sometimes it would produce the opposite effect. Therefore, the application of wisdom was extremely subtle indeed. It depended on one's heart and did not allow for other thoughts. His elegant voice continued to ring, the content of his words growing more vicious as he spoke. It was no longer a part of his so-called elegance. That day, during the battle at Tianshan Cliff, the 9 Supremes whose names shook the nations of Tianshan had all come, but they had all lost the powers that made them famous. The scene of corpses flying everywhere was still fresh in my mind. Until now, I still remember that Supreme Earth, the leader of the 9 Supremes, had disintegrated instantly under a single palm strike. Even his head seemed to have been split into 7 or 8 pieces. Supreme Earth is worthy of being Supreme Earth, turning his life into soil in the end. I wonder if he can still live. Even if he dies, it's a worthy death. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Of course, Supreme Earth wants to perish in the earth. Yun Yang felt his heart wrenching violently, the pain indescribable. It was a suffocating pain, an extreme agony that could not be described with words. Yet he had to endure it. He had to endure it with all his might. No matter how painful it was, no matter how unbearable it was, he had to persevere. I can't be angry. I cannot be impulsive. He's forcing me to go out by saying that. He's so concerned about my life and death. It must be because the 9 Supremes have the power to shake him. I must not be impulsive, I must wait for the future, but I really want to rush out now and fight to the death. No one knew and no one could understand how painful and unbearable this kind of endurance was. It was as if his body, soul, and mind were being cut into pieces over and over again, but he still had to maintain his ice-cold composure. The voice from outside was still like a demonic voice that penetrated his brain. The voice laughed weirdly. Does it hurt? Do you feel so much pain that you want to die? Do you feel like you're about to collapse? He really wanted to fight with his life on the line. Wouldn't it be 10,000 times better than this? That's the happiest, the proudest work of my life. When the other 9 Supremes saw that Supreme Earth was dead, he actually went berserk. He charged forward without any form of defense. Of course, he was beaten into minced meat on the spot, dying even more thoroughly than Supreme Earth. Also, that Supreme Gold or whatever he was, actually provoked him in front of so many experts, saying that he wanted to fight one-on-one. Now that I think about it, the impulse back then was probably to cover for your preparation, wasn't it? The dusty memories of the past surged once more. Yun Yang's body, soul, and mind were heavily pressured, and he was on the verge of collapsing. He had been controlling himself not to recall or think about the bloody past. Now, however, it was being dug up again by the mastermind of the incident. Yun Yang felt that his memories were still fresh in the depths of his heart, without a single detail left out. Today's situation is destined to end in death. However, we brothers can't all die here. It was the eldest Supreme Earth who was speaking. His voice was heavy and stern. Among us brothers, we can only strike once with our remaining abilities. There can't be any mishaps. Right now, the best outcome is only enough for one person to survive. I hope that this person is OL 9th. Supreme Earth's voice was urgent. His eyes scanned his brothers again and again, as if trying to remember them so that they could reunite when they reached the underworld of the underworld. Well, 9th is the youngest among us, but he's the smartest among the 9 of us. He acts only after planning, anticipates the enemy's moves, and is far-sighted. At the same time, only if he's alive can he open the residence of 9 Supremes immediately and obtain Ol 8's legacy, and even our cultivation methods. He can cultivate all of the 9 Supremes' arcane skills alone, gathering the might of the 9 Supremes in one body. As for the others, they can only open it from the middle. They can only get a part of it, not all of it. Therefore we can die, but OL 9th has to live on. Give him this glimmer of hope. Pin the last glimmer of hope on him. As long as Supreme Cloud isn't dead, the legend of the 9 Supremes won't die. In the future, he will be the new 9 Supremes. The other brothers did not speak, listening to Supreme Earth's arrangement seriously. Their eyes were filled with agreement. None of them had any hesitation or doubt. The only voice of disapproval came from, I don't agree. Yin Yang seemed to hear his own voice. If we live together. If we die together. What's the point of giving me that glimmer of hope? I don't want it. Don't look down on me. What's there to be afraid of? What he had said then was like a child who was trying to be brave. There was no hint of a wise man's calmness in the face of danger. Knock him out. Take off his mask and find a brother to replace him. They can't cast their arcane skills anyway, it's the same for 800 people. Now, whoever puts on the mask can be Supreme Cloud, one of the 9 Supremes. It was Supreme Earth's voice, growling fiercely. It was also the last few words Yin Yang had heard, the last few words from his brothers. Scratch his face, make it look like he's heavily injured. O youngest, good brother. Live on. You must live on. If you die, we brothers will really have no hope at all. Then he did not know anything, completely entering a state of suspended animation. At that time he was drowned in the same excruciating agony. His head had also suffered a heavy blow, causing him to be completely muddled. The only thing he could feel was the vibrations of his brother's power. It was the activation of the remaining arcane skills. Then there was no more then. When he woke up, he realized that he was like a tattered rag doll, buried in the ground with only one leg sticking out of the ground. No, it was broken outside and had been chopped into several pieces. His head was like a rotten watermelon. There was a large hole in his chest where his heart was, a hole that could have been fatal. Obviously, although his brothers had disguised themselves, the enemy had not given up on any chance of survival. His head had still been smashed and a large hole had been punched through his heart. As for being buried in the ground, it must have been because someone had covered up all the corpses in the end. It was just that the combination of the 9 Supremes' remaining power had triggered the Cloud Manifestation's ability. Under the spiritual restraining formation, the Cloud Manifestation's ability had worked, allowing Yun Yang to survive the fatal injury, creating a miracle of life. There was also the Lotus Seed. That was why he was where he was now. My brother's hopes were all on me. I can't go out, I can't die. Outside, Mr. Nian's malicious voice could be heard. It's normal that you don't understand why we did it. On the other hand, I don't understand why you didn't die as well. There were 809 people in total, and we managed to gather 809 corpses. There's no mistake about this. In the end, everyone was dismembered, their hearts broken, their brains crippled. Supreme Cloud, why aren't you dead yet? Yun Yang's heart was bleeding. It doesn't matter that you're still resilient and unwilling to come out. I'll stay here with you until you can't take it anymore, or until the moment you can't take it anymore and come out. The voice outside said faintly, Yutong's eastern defense is about to be breached anyway. The Empire of Yutong is about to become history. Whether you come out or not, you can't change this inevitable trend. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, this reputed one will be waiting here with you. A faint chuckle could be heard. Actually, this isn't too bad. At the very least, this reputed one knows that you're here. As long as you're not dead, this reputed one will sense it. I'll let you persevere like this, waiting for the Empire of Yutong that you've protected with your life to perish. By the time you come out, everything will have vanished into thin air. That's a pretty good ending, isn't it? Yun Yang's heart sank. This was Yun Yang's other weakness right now, and it was indeed extremely difficult to deal with. If he were to be trapped here, no matter how valiant and fearless Fu Baoguo was on the Eastern Front, he would still be powerless against Han Sanhe's million-strong army and the power of an entire nation. He would never be a match for them. Once the Eastern Front was breached, they would march straight in. Yutong was defenseless. It would definitely be under Han Sanhe's steel cavalry. Chapter 452. Yun Yang was indeed anxious about the current situation, but there was nothing he could do. There was nothing he could do. Facing such a terrifying enemy, whether he could stay alive and ensure that he would not be found and killed was already more difficult than ascending to heaven. There was no need to even think about escaping or winning the battle. Those were already far-fetched dreams. However, how should he deal with the current situation? Of course, we won't bear the great karma of a dynasty's rise and fall, but trapping you here is enough to seal this karma. It was still Mr. Nian's voice, but this time, he was guffawing into the sky, high-spirited as if everything was within his grasp. The truth was that everything was within his grasp. Yun Yang could only endure it without moving, endure it forever, until his energy was depleted and he could no longer hold it in. There was no way to resolve the current situation. Despite his anxiety, Yun Yang's heart was about to explode, but there was nothing he could do. The eastern battlefield. The army that Han Sanhe had deployed stretched dozens of miles. Wherever it passed, it was like a black torrent that devoured everything. The empire of Dongxuan's main force was moving at a slow pace. All the water sources along the way were under their control, without the slightest mistake. All the land near the battlefield had been plowed to ensure that all the trees and plants within sight had been cleared. Some of the steep peaks were even flattened by the ace cultivators Han Sanhe had sent. Dongxuan's military base was arranged into a huge fan shape. It was concave in the middle. Dongxuan's army maintained this formation and continued to advance. All the air vents along the way had been widened. Although the four empires had worked together to trap Supreme Cloud in Zio, Han Sanhe would never let his guard down like De Yuan's marshal. The formation that he had set up now was a special formation that specifically targeted and guarded against the 9 Supremes. Be it wind, cloud, thunder, lightning, water, or fire, you can forget about opening an opening here. If you're already trapped in Zio, that's great. However, if you're not, you won't have a place to strike even if you come to this battlefield. At the very least, if you want to directly cause great losses like before, it's absolutely impossible. On the main battlefield, there were only 200,000 men from Zhang Gu troop who had arrived to fight Fu Baoguo head-on. Both sides advanced and retreated. They had been in a stalemate for a long time. Fu Baogua's face remained calm and composed, calm and capable, unmoving like a mountain. Every day he would find a certain time to gather his generals and joke around. He looked extremely relaxed and carefree, as if he did not care about his opponent or the battle at all. However, when he was alone, his face would immediately turn into a frown, and he would be deeply worried. The Dongxian Warsong army they were facing now was merely the vanguard. The real test was yet to come. However, the current situation was like a raging fire, abnormally intense. The military camp that Zhang Gu troop belonged to had never entered the main battlefield, only sending out a small force to harass the enemy each day. Every few days they would send out a large army to attack, but they would retreat after a period of intense battle, never lingering to fight. Fu Baogua knew that Zhang Gu was only exhausting his combat power bit by bit, turning himself into an army that was weary from the prolonged battle to create favorable conditions for Han Sanhe's army to arrive. However, it was one thing to understand, there was nothing he could do about it. He could only react passively and passively achieve the enemy's goal. Han Sanhe had yet to arrive at the main battlefield. Along the way, he had used every method that he should and should not have used to defend against the Nine Supremes' ambush. As for Fu Baogua, he had also adopted the strategy of fortifying the walls and clearing the field. The mountains on the left and right of the Fortress of Resilience had been cleared by Fu Baogua. Even the rocks had been moved into the Fortress of Resilience to be used for war. The few mountains nearby had been destroyed as well. The trees in the forest further away had not been cleared, but Fu Baogua's army had turned them into sharp tree stumps that were half a man's height. Countless traps had been set up to cover the entire mountain range, ensuring that the mountains would not become Dongxuan's supporting force. Fu Baogua had set up no less than 100,000 traps within thousands of miles. Basically, the entire ground, including the forest, had turned into a beehive. Yutong's eastern front faced the Empire of Dongxian. The empire's national power was the greatest in the world, and they had the continent's top general, Han Sanhe, as their marshal. Therefore, the eastern front had always been Yutong's most deployed military force. Currently, both sides of the battlefield were heavily guarded. Yutong's 350,000 men had been arranged into a swallow-wing defensive formation by Fu Baogua. From top to bottom, front to back, left to right, they were guarded like a steel bucket, impenetrable and unassailable. However, such a formation and arrangement could only be used under normal circumstances, or perhaps most circumstances. Once Han Sanhe's main force arrived, they would only need to engage in battle to destroy most of their traps. Every day that Han Sanhe's main force arrived at the main battlefield, there would be reinforcements from the Empire of Yutong. There were those sent by the Empire of Yutong, those who came on their own accord, martial artists from the martial world came to help, and there were even groups of sects who came to help. All in all, there was an endless stream of reinforcements. Every day the number of reinforcements would increase by tens of thousands. Even so, Fu Baogua had never felt truly relaxed. Martial artists who were skilled in martial arts had individual combat power that far surpassed ordinary soldiers. But once they entered the battlefield, their effectiveness might not be as great. The most important thing on the battlefield had always been discipline. It was cooperation. It was not individual heroism, it was one man's recklessness. These reinforcements had to go through a certain level of training before they could enter the battlefield. Otherwise, not only would their assistance be useless, it might even cause the opposite effect. Relatively speaking, it was the sects who could use them without worry. After all, there was discipline in the sects. There was teamwork and tacit understanding between them. In spite of this, they still could not blend into the military formation and be used as regular soldiers. Just a simple command and strict execution of orders was something that these reinforcements could never achieve. Looking afar from the Fortress of Resilience, dust billowed into the sky from the east, banners blotting out the sun. From Dongxuan's direction, another troop had arrived at the Fortress of Resilience. Fu Baogua's frown deepened. With a glance, he could easily tell that the other party had sent another 200,000 soldiers. In spite of this, Han Sanhe's main force was still at the back, advancing slowly and unhurriedly. These few days it was not only Yutong who had been sending in reinforcements, but Dongxian had also been sending in endless reinforcements. At this moment, from almost every direction within Dongxian nation, there were troops coming to reinforce them. Zhangji's location was like an ocean where hundreds of rivers converged, attracting all the small lakes in the Empire of Dongxian to gather and converge here. The troops would converge and attack in unison. If the enemy troops were to converge successfully, the enemy's morale would be boosted while their own troops would feel the pressure of a mountain pressing down on them. It would be detrimental to the military's morale. Wang Dinghua. Fu Baoguo was decisive as he hollered coldly. He summoned his best general. Yes, sir. I'll give you 30,000 steel cavalry. Charge forward. Yes. The enemy's reinforcements have just arrived and their morale is at its peak. We must destroy this morale. Fu Baoguo's eyes were gleaming as his voice was chilling. I'll give you 30,000 steel cavalry for this battle to be a complete victory, but on top of that, I have a request. You have to bring back at least 25,000 men after the assault. This lowly general, as long as one person is missing, you'll be punished according to military law. Fu Baoguo snorted coldly. The current situation is disadvantageous to us. Only by breaking through the formation with minimal casualties and dampening the enemy's morale can we shock the enemy. If I let you and your 30,000 steel cavalry die in the enemy's formation, what's there to shock about, no matter how valiant your death is? The enemy can afford to die, but our army can't. This lowly general understands. I'll do my best until the day I die. The key to this battle is that the enemy has just arrived. Although their morale is high, it's inevitable that their men and horses will be exhausted. You can weave in between Zhang Ji's troops and the new troops, then kill your way back. As long as you're quick, it won't be difficult to achieve your goal. Fu Baoguo looked at the two troops that were rapidly approaching each other from afar and said coldly, they want to boost their morale and unite their armies. Even the cowards in the army would feel a sudden surge of bravery and confidence when it comes to something like this. As for me, I'll let you completely destroy this courage and confidence of theirs. Even if you can't destroy Dongxuan's morale, at least the morale of the two troops converging must not appear. Go. Wang Dinghua bellowed, taking the token arrow and turning to stride out, his face filled with determination. Fu Baoguo's expression was steely. He knew that the enemy's morale had been rising during this period of time. Right now was the best time to dampen their morale. When they had accumulated their morale to a certain level, he would annihilate them in one fell swoop. This would be the juncture where the enemy would feel defeated. As long as the plan was accomplished successfully, the army before them would not be much of a threat for a long period of time, at least until Han Sanha arrived, no matter how many troops there were. Now that the enemy's reinforcements had just arrived, Zhang Gu was welcoming them while the shadow cavalry was still recuperating in the front line. If he took a detour and plunged right into the enemy's midst, the shadow cavalry would not be able to react in time. When the shadow cavalry moved again, the distance between them would be enough for Wang Dinghua to rush over with his men and rush back. He believed that when his steel cavalry charged back, the enemy's shadow cavalry would still be speeding up. They would not have the chance to meet each other after all. Whether we can fight for the time to recuperate before Han Sanha's main force arrives depends on this battle. Chapter 453. The 150,000 steel cavalry that Tai Zheng had left behind were Yutong's most elite troop and also his trump card in this battle. Wang Dinghua was the best general under him. They should have more than a 90% chance of winning this battle. This timing was a God-given opportunity that would not come again if they missed it. Although there would be casualties when they charged into the formation, it would not be too much. In terms of the current war, this loss was extremely valuable. Mercy does not command soldiers. Love does not establish authority. Righteousness does not manage finances. Kindness does not serve as an official. Baoguo, mercy does not command soldiers. This is the first. What? Fu Baoguo closed his eyes, the old Grand Commandant Fang Qingtian's earnest teachings flashing through his mind. Baoguo, what is war? War, to both empires, is a battle of manpower, military force, material resources, financial resources, and perseverance. Whoever can last until the end will be the overlord, the winner. However, to the marshal, war is a battle of casualties, exhaustion, and lives. It's a battle of who can last the longest. Whoever survives in the end will be the winner. You must remember that there is only victory and defeat on the battlefield. There is no mercy, no life. Fu Baoguo heaved a long sigh towards the sky. Teacher, listening to the uniform galloping of horses and Wang Dinghua's loud roar, followed by the thunderous sounds of attacks, he opened his eyes and looked at the determined and courageous warriors. No one was confident that they could come back alive after charging out this time. There would definitely be casualties. He just didn't know which familiar faces would be missing from this square formation. Teacher, what you said makes sense, but these are my comrades, my brothers? Wang Dinghua galloped forward on his horse. The cold wind that was mixed with the smell of blood on the battlefield blew on his face, but he didn't feel a trace of coldness or sternness, because the only feeling he had right now was that the blood in his entire body was burning. He felt like he was about to explode. It was at this moment, right now. In front of him was the enemy, beside him were his comrades, beneath him was a warhorse, and in his hands was a sharp blade. Beneath his feet was the battlefield. His eyes suddenly turned red as if they had been dyed with blood. The 30,000 steel cavalry that Fu Baogua had given them followed behind him, galloping silently as well. Everyone knew that even though they had anticipated the enemy's moves, casualties were inevitable and they might not be able to survive. However, no one thought too much about not being able to return because everyone could feel their blood boiling just like Wang Dinghua. The fighting spirit in Wang Dinghua's heart seemed to have infected every single one of the 30,000 cavalry behind him. Every pair of eyes was filled with burning morale. Only a fierce battle could truly let this fire be completely released. Although no one spoke, they couldn't help but urge their horses to move faster and faster. 30,000 men from the steel cavalry took a detour and charged out of Yutong's camp from the other side like a raging dragon. Then they turned into a sharp arrow on the icy field, charging towards the east without turning back. Wang Dinghua was at the forefront, like the sharpest arrowhead, whistling in the air as he tore through the wind and obstructions. His entire body was on the horse's back, his upper body hanging in the air. His entire body was leaning forward, his hips dangling on the horse's back. His center of gravity was placed in front as well. Anyone who had ridden a horse before would know that doing so could save a lot of horsepower, and at the same time, it could create an inertia for the warhorse to charge forward. It was not only Wang Dinghua himself who was doing so, the 30,000 men behind him were doing the same. They were all moving forward, their hands not even holding the reins, only pressing their left hands lightly on the horses' heads while their right hands gripped their weapons tightly, allowing them to stick close to the horses as if they were one. Their eyes were glowing with sparks, their blood boiling. They were all waiting quietly, waiting for the moment they would truly come into contact with the enemy. Once they did, the most brilliant blood in the world would erupt. The man on the horse seemed to have sensed the desire for battle in his companion's heart. It was as if the horse beneath him had also sensed the desire for battle and slaughter in his companion's heart. For a moment, it also bent over with all its might. Originally, it was able to cover a distance of 3 zhang in a single step. But now, with all its might, the horse's hooves soared into the air as it madly sprinted forward. It had already covered a distance of 4 to 5 zhang. The blood of the men was burning. The blood of the war horses seemed to be burning at the same time, unstoppable. Just as Fu Baogua had expected, the enemy did not even manage to react to the sudden appearance of the ambush. After all, Fu Baogua had been like a cowardly tortoise in his shell these past few days. He did not step out and did not engage in battle, creating a subtle feeling of defending until the very end. No one had expected him to choose to launch an attack when the enemy's 2 armies had converged and were at their peak. The 30,000 men from the steel cavalry had already galloped more than half the distance to their target before the enemy scouts in the camp blared their horns to warn them. Ha ha! Wang Dinghua howled into the sky. At this moment, the biting cold wind was still howling, sweeping past his body at high speed. His battle robe made a violent crackling sound as it was blown by the wind. Wang Dinghua's voice seemed to suddenly appear in the middle of winter like a thunderclap in the clear sky, abruptly resounding in the air. Brothers? Wang Dinghua's voice was hoarse and high-pitched, like a thunderclap. The 30,000 men from the steel cavalry hollered in unison. Here. We are Yutong steel cavalry. Wang Dinghua roared. Unrivaled. The 30,000 men from the steel cavalry replied in unison. We were born here. Born here. We grew up here. We grew up here. This is our land. Our land? This is the land we swore to defend with our lives. The land we swore to defend with our lives. Defend with our lives. Defend with our lives. Wave after wave of voices rose higher and higher, becoming louder and louder. The morale of the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry had already reached its peak. Now, with Wang Dinghua's thunderous roar, they felt like they had broken through their limits again. They were so excited that they were about to explode. The enemy is in front of us. Wang Dinghua's pupils seemed to be dilating. His blood was coursing through his veins. Enemy! The 30,000 men roared in unison. Comrades are beside us. Comrades! Home is behind us. Home? The sound waves in the surroundings became louder and louder. The momentum was unstoppable, and it surged powerfully in the sky above the icy battlefield. It was like thunder exploding in the sky over and over again. It was deafening and soul-stirring. For our parents. In Wang Dinghua's eyes, he could already see the 2 armies that were converging. They had split up their men and were mobilizing urgently to face him, intending to stop his charge. He raised his hand slowly, the 17-foot-long steel blade in his hand glowing brightly. Parents. The 30,000 men from the steel cavalry raised their weapons at the same time, pointing their blades forward. For our children. Children. For our women. Women. Their voices grew louder and louder until they turned into thunder that shook one to the core. Yutong's steel cavalry could no longer hold back the blood that was gushing out of their hearts. They howled into the sky, their auras like raging lions as they charged down the mountain. The arrows in front of them rained down like a storm, raining down on their heads. Kill. Wang Dinghua swung his saber and leaped with his steed, charging into the rain of arrows like a black comet and into the enemy's formation. Almost at the same time, a rain of blood sprayed into the air. This battle was destined to be a legendary epic forged by steel and blood. Wang Dinghua, who was at the forefront, was like a red-hot blade that was plunged into the icy-cold cream on the other side. Kill? Behind him, the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry roared in unison, as if they were about to bellow the blood that was coursing through their hearts. Each of them felt as if every strand of their hair was standing on end. The 30,000 men from the steel cavalry were like an unstoppable black flood, roaring as they charged into the enemy's formation at the fastest speed possible. They were unstoppable and there was no turning back. It was as if a miracle had happened. The long-distance assault had continued until now, but the giant triangular arrow formed by the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry did not show any signs of disorder. Not a single person was left behind. Each of the steel cavalry was guarding their respective positions strictly. In the formation, the 30,000 men seemed to have formed a single entity as they charged into the point where the enemy's hundreds of thousands of troops were gathered. Far away, Zhang Gu, who had been waiting to meet up with his comrades but had been forced to stand on a higher spot due to the sudden incident, suddenly shuddered subconsciously when he saw the scene. This was because, the instant the 30,000 steel cavalry crashed into their camp in an unstoppable manner, Zhang Gu clearly saw a neat wave of blood suddenly soar into the sky. His entire field of vision turned crimson at that very moment. The battlefield seemed to have frozen at that very moment. All of his movements seemed to have turned into slow motion. The wave of blood rose into the air and lingered in the air. By the time the rain of blood fell, the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry had charged through like a sharp arrow. This kind of speed was simply unheard of. But at that moment, Wang Dinghua and his men from the steel cavalry did not notice that their speed had already created history in cavalry. They only roared crazily and pressed forward. Charge! Charge! Chapter 454. Blood rained down on the ground, dyeing the ground crimson, but not a single drop landed on the 30,000 men of the steel cavalry. How fast, how efficient, how sensational, and how unbelievable was this? Wang Dinghua was still leading the charge. His mind was blank. He could not think of anything else. There was only the enemy in his eyes. There was only the front. That was a true sense of not turning back, moving forward courageously. Yutong's steel cavalry? Wang Dinghua roared. He was still leaning forward to conserve his horse's energy, but the saber in his hand had already turned into a ray of light. Pu piu piu. 40 to 50 heads flew into the sky in succession. There were also more than 10 severed upper bodies that fell in all directions. Perfectly round pillars of blood shot up into the sky. By the time the corpses fell to the ground, Wang Dinghua and his steed had already charged at least 1,000 feet ahead of them. He was so fast, so unstoppable, so unstoppable. Unrivaled in the world. The 30,000 men behind him roared along with Wang Dinghua's roar. 30,000 men of the steel cavalry followed Wang Dinghua like a torrential flood, charging forward without any interruption. 30,000 men were like one man. This was definitely a highlight in the history of cavalry warfare. Kill? Wang Dinghua's voice was gradually turning hoarse. He had obviously shouted too much, but his aura did not diminish. Instead it increased. Kill. 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 The steel cavalry roared. 10,000 men pointed forward, another 10,000 to the left, and another 10,000 to the right. They continued to charge forward without a hint of panic. With a loud clang, an enemy general in front of Wang Dinghua was knocked back 30 feet along with his horse. Both man and horse bled from their orifices as they looked at Wang Dinghua in despair. However, Wang Dinghua did not even spare them a glance as he galloped away in a cloud of dust. He had risked his life to intercept them, but they didn't even have the qualifications to look at him. The enemy general was dead. Even as he breathed his last, he died with a grievance. Woo-woo. The sound of a special horn could be heard. Wang Dinghua knew in his heart that the enemy was mobilizing their archers. gathering a large number of archers to focus on sniping and killing. However, Wang Dinghua really didn't care about anything. There was only one belief in his heart. Pierce? Wang Dinghua once again roared to the sky. Leading the 30,000 cavalrymen, he charged forward in a straight line amidst the converging army of the enemy. Wherever he passed, men and horses were thrown off their feet, heads rolled, limbs flew, and blood flowed like a stream. The aura sent chills down the spines of all the Dongxian soldiers who were fighting Yutong's steel cavalry. His heart was filled with a chill that was much worse than the midwinter snow that his body had to endure. Was he still human? With another loud clang, Wang Dinghua split the 3 Dongxian soldiers in front of him into 6 pieces. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sense of relief as his vision cleared up. He had already broken through the enemy's rear formation. The first half of the chisel tactic was completed. Success. Wang Dinghua did not turn back with his horse. Instead, he maintained his forward speed and galloped for about 20,000 feet before he turned his horse around and made a half circle. In front of his saber was still Dongxuan's formation. The galloping was still thunderous, the entire troop was still orderly. The 30,000 steel cavalry followed Wang Dinghua in a half circle, almost unscathed, facing Dongxuan's troop head-on, drenched in blood. Every single one of them had blood dripping down from their bodies, armor, and heads. Each of them was dyed red, blood red. It was as if tens of thousands of death gods had suddenly descended to the mortal world. The fiendish aura that was condensed by this team of assassins was not only daunting, it was simply terrifying to the point that one's heart and soul would scatter with just a glance. Wang Dinghua did not stop. With a loud roar, he launched the second wave of chisel tactic. Yutong's steel cavalry. Charge back with me. Charge back. Behind him, all the steel cavalry bellowed in unison as before. Their legs clamped on their horses' abdomens and their bodies left the saddle, stretching forward to their limits. Each of them howled like they were possessed by demons as they raised their weapons and followed behind Wang Dinghua. After charging for 2 breaths, the neat formation turned into a black whirlwind and a black arrow once more. It was still unstoppable and unstoppable. Dongxian brat. Who dares fight your father? Wang Dinghua felt his blood burning to its limit, his blood vessels expanding like never before as he roared into the sky. Together with his horse, he charged into Dongxuan's formation once more. At this moment, even if all the pinnacle experts in the world were to intercept him, Wang Dinghua would still dare to fight without hesitation. The accumulation of his aura at this moment had truly risen to a level of invincibility. At the very least, his aura was unquestionable and impeccable. Fight! 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 The tens of thousands of steel cavalry behind Wang Dinghua roared similarly, their blood vessels expanding as they charged into the enemy's formation. They charged forward like a hot knife through butter, advancing as if there was no one there. This time, there were countless arrows soaring into the sky from both sides of the steel cavalry, raining down like a dark storm. Dongxian was obviously not prepared for the steel cavalry's charge, but they were already prepared to counter it. The dense rain of arrows from both sides was the best counterattack they could come up with at the moment. However, the current best and most targeted counterattack strategy might not be able to produce immediate results and be effective. The steel cavalry was fully armored. As long as they were not unlucky enough to be shot in the face, they would be fine. Even against the rain of arrows, the tens of thousands of steel cavalry continued to press forward. Wherever they passed, it was still the same as before. Men and horses were thrown off their feet. Many of the Dongxian soldiers felt their guts shattering when they saw them charging over. They instinctively wanted to dodge, no longer having the thought of fighting or intercepting them. The ground in the distance shook. That was Dongxuan's elite troop, the shadow cavalry that could rival the steel cavalry, moving in full force, waiting to strike. Wang Dinghua's roar was like thunder. Standing at the forefront, he was practically shaking the enemy's formation single-handedly, but no one could stop him, not even for a second, a snap of a finger, a split second. Wherever he passed, he only needed to swing his saber and he would be unimpeded. The horn sounded tragically in the enemy's formation. It was the order to fight to the death, the activation of the battle strategy. It was obvious that Dongxuan's main general had the intention to kill the 30,000 steel cavalry. He wanted to bury all 30,000 of them here. When such a military order was given, every soldier in Dongxuan's army would turn into a sacrificial warrior at once. Those who did not charge forward would be punished by military law, beheading on the spot. The battle grew more intense because of that. The steel cavalry continued to charge forward in a frenzy like a thunderstorm, but the enemy's counterattack suddenly became unusually fierce as well. Extreme against extreme, the consequences were extremely devastating. Many of the steel cavalry were pushed off their steeds by Dongxuan's warriors who suddenly pounced on them. Falling off their steeds abruptly, both of them were trampled into meat paste by the people around them, but their steeds continued to follow the formation, charging forward with their original momentum. Yutong's steel cavalry was unmoved by the sacrifice of their comrades and the fall of their steeds. Their eyes were only focused forward. Charge. Kill. In such a battle atmosphere, falling off one's steed was equivalent to being consigned to eternal damnation. No expert, no master could save the fallen from their steeds from such a battle. Kill. Kill. Wang Dinghua led the charge, guffawing like thunder. His saber light was like lightning. He was like a god of war that knew no fatigue. Heads were rolling in front of him, and fresh blood was flowing like a waterfall. Behind him, his comrades were constantly falling off their horses. Just as the battle was gradually reaching its climax, Wang Dinghua let out another wild roar. His front suddenly felt relaxed, and he once again rushed out of the enemy's formation. Behind him, a black torrent surged forward without stopping. The piercing tactic was a success once again. Now the established strategy was completed. Wang Dingchao was still galloping madly on his horse. His tall and sturdy body suddenly stood upright on the horse's back. He pointed his blood-dripping long saber towards the sky and shouted loudly, "Brothers, we have won this battle. Follow me home." This was not an order to the troops behind him, but a ritual to summon the souls of their fallen brothers from Yutong's steel cavalry after each battle. Behind him, all the Yutong steel cavalry who had charged out of the enemy's formation stood up on their steeds at the same time, their weapons pointed at the sky. "Brothers, come home with us." Brr. Wang Dinghua hollered. All the steel cavalry behind him roared in unison, "Don't worry, brothers, I'm still here. The family's matters shall be shouldered by me. You have meritorious military service, I have my life. Father and children shall not worry for the rest of their lives." This was the practice of Yutong's steel cavalry. The first thing the survivors did after every battle was to look for their comrades' family and take good care of them. It was also the last consolation to the loyal souls. A steel torrent charged out of the enemy's formation, still a sharp triangular arrowhead, charging forward with an indomitable will. When we fight, we press forward, those who stand in our way are invincible. When we charge out, when we return with the souls of our brothers, we still press forward with an indomitable will. Yutong's steel cavalry will always be Yutong's steel cavalry. Life and death are the same. 4th chapter. Seeking monthly votes. These few chapters have made my blood boil. Chapter 455. Yutong's steel cavalry roared as they galloped away, returning victorious. It was a pity that it was not a complete victory. It would only be a complete victory if none of the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry were killed. However, that was only a fantasy in novels. In a real battle, how could none of them be killed when 30,000 men charged? Behind the 30,000 steel cavalry galloped away was the messy Dongshan military camp. The trail of blood was still open, a ghastly sight to behold. It was at this moment that a cavalry from the left charged over like a raging dragon. The leader hollered furiously from afar, "Wang Dinghua, stay and fight me if you have the guts." Wang Dinghua could not help guffawing when he heard the challenge. Suddenly he roared into the sky, "Yutong's steel cavalry." Behind him all his comrades guffawed at the same time. Unrivaled in the world. Wang Dinghua did not slow down at all as he led the charge towards his own military camp, roaring, "Dongxuan Shadow Cavalry. Just bullsh *T. Dongxuan Shadow Cavalry is just bullsh *T. The steel cavalry behind him galloped away, guffawing. "The next time we meet I'll take your head." Wang Dinghua guffawed. "Grandpa is tired today, I won't keep you company." Ah. Amidst the maniacal laughter, Yutong's steel cavalry charged back like a torrent. The Dongshin Shadow Cavalry who had rushed over almost spat blood when they heard the string of words. They were only 10 breaths away from stopping the enemy. Each of the Shadow Cavalry's warhorses had almost broken their legs from running to catch up to Yutong's steel cavalry, but they were still a short distance away, unable to stop the enemy. In the end, they could only watch the enemy gallop away like an arrow released from a bow. They had even brushed past each other. They were fuming with rage, but there was no place for them to vent it. Poof. The leader of Dongshuan's Shadow Cavalry slammed the spear in his hand onto the ground in front of him, causing a large piece of ground to fly up as he cursed, "Wang Dinghua, I must kill you." With a wave of his hand he ordered, "Go back." Witnessing the steel cavalry's charge like a gust of wind and retreat like a torrent, his gaze was filled with awe. The valiance of the steel cavalry was so uniform that it had reached a horrifying level. How could such a strong army be destroyed? Fu Baogua, as expected of a famous marshal of a generation, attacking at this time was obvious. However, he had done it. Zhang Gu looked at the generals and Dongxian soldiers around him. Everyone's faces were filled with rage and humiliation, but it was undeniable that there was still a faint trace of fear on everyone's faces. There was a deep sense of shock at the bottom of everyone's eyes. The high morale and confidence of victory that had been built up because of Fu Baogua's cowardice and passive defense, as well as the jubilation from the reunion of the two armies, had vanished without a trace. The biggest loss of this battle was that their high morale had been ruthlessly smashed back into the dust by the enemy. Zhang Gu understood that it would be difficult to raise their morale within a short period of time. In other words, before Marshal Han Sanhe's main force arrived, Dongxuan's army would be exhausted. It was not that they were powerless to fight, but they had lost the drive that they should have. The enemy's 30,000 cavalrymen charged through the formation and broke through the confluence of 300,000 soldiers twice. After killing them, they swaggered away. The enemy's morale was so high because of this that it could be ignited. If he were to attack now, there was a high chance that Fu Baogua would deploy all his troops to fight him. However, one side's morale was low, while the other side's fighting spirit was high. Under such a contrast of morale, he had no hope of victory. He could only suffer a crushing defeat, or even collapse at the slightest touch. His army would collapse like a landslide and he would suffer a crushing defeat. Zhang Gu could not afford such a result. All troops fall back and reorganize. Shadow cavalry, point forward to prevent the enemy from attacking again. Zhang Gu could only give the order after a long moment of thought. He sighed inwardly. He had thought that he was not inferior to the world's famous generals, at least not too far away. He had even belittled Fu Baogua's defense earlier, thinking that the other was merely SOSO and that he was undeserving of being called the top of Yutong's younger generation. Today, however, he had been taught a bloody lesson by Fu Baogua, whom he had looked down on. Indeed, those who could rank at the top of the ranking of famous generals were not to be trifled with. The top of Yutong's younger generation, one of Yutong's 3 military bosses, Fang Qingqian's appointed successor, lived up to his reputation. Such a grasp of the battle opportunity, such a swift and decisive method, such an unexpected tactic. It's indeed sharp and impressive. Zhang Ji's eyes glowed with fighting spirit as he murmured, "But no matter how good you, Fu Baogua, are, you're definitely not teacher's opponent." His teacher, Han Sanhe, was the continent's top general. However, Zhang Gu did not realize that he had forever lost the right to compete with Fu Baogua on the battlefield when he thought so. Wang Dinghua spurred his horse forward like a sharp arrow, charging to the front of Yutong's army. Fu Baogua was already standing at the door. His arms were behind his back, his expression calm. Looking at his expression, it was as if Wang Dinghua had only contributed a little in this battle and was not worthy of praise at all. It was nothing like the meritorious deed he had mentioned earlier. In spite of this, the slight trembling of his hands behind his back had long betrayed him, expressing his true feelings at the moment. Fu Baogua was also sweating profusely about this battle. Even if the success rate of this battle was already 90% and his previous actions had confused the enemy's general, causing them to underestimate him, indirectly contributing to the success of this battle, there was still a great risk involved. What if the enemy's general did not fall for it? What if he thought deeper? What if he saw through his plan? The marshal of the enemy, Zhang Gu, was also a famous general of Dongxian. He was almost the top person in Dongxuan's military after Han Sanhe. His reputation was well known as well. If Zhang Gu had seen through Yun Yang's intentions, he only needed to conceal the Dongxian shadow cavalry behind where the two armies converged and wait for the steel cavalry to attack, intercepting them head-on. Then all 30,000 steel cavalry would be annihilated without a doubt. Fortunately, they had finally won this battle. Their mission was a success. The steel cavalry came like a gust of wind, stopping neatly in front of the army with a long horn. Wang Baogua turned his horse around and hollered sternly, "Steel cavalry, count the men." He leaned forward slightly. The casualties of the 30,000 steel cavalry had been counted. Wang Baogua turned to face Fu Baogua. "Marshal, this general has given the order. We've pierced through the enemy twice in this battle. 30,000 steel cavalry, but there are still 27,352 men left." Although his voice was heroic, there was an indescribable hoarseness in it. It was only now that the sorrow surged up like a tidal wave. The 27,352 men behind him sat unmoving on their horses like javelins, but their eyes were glistening with tears. 30,000 men had attacked the enemy's two armies, a total of 300,000 men, but they had only lost 2,648 men. It was less than 11%. It was a glorious victory. However, the Steel Cavalry brothers' hearts were heavy at this moment. More than 2,000 brothers who had been with them day and night, who had been so close to them, had been buried in the battlefield. Not even their bones were left. Opposite them, Fu Baoguo's expression was solemn as he raised his hand to salute and said in a low voice, "All troops, listen up. All of you salute our 2,648 brothers. Send them off. I wish all of you a safe journey." The thumping of the war drums reverberated in a soul-stirring manner. The loyal souls shall not perish, they shall live with the nation. When Yutong's warriors died in battle, they would send them off with the beating of the war drums whenever they had time to spare. Perhaps, other generals would pay homage after the war ended, to pay tribute to the loyal souls. However, Fu Baoguo would not do so. The first thing he did after each battle was to send off the warriors who had died in battle. He wished that their souls would not be far away, and that they could still hear the farewells of their comrades from their homeland. Well done. Really well done. Fu Baoguo's Adam's apple bobbed twice, his voice dry. He blinked his eyes hard, trying to control his sorrowful emotions as he called out hoarsely, "Wang Dinghua, here. Later, I want you to find out the names, achievements, life experiences, birthplaces of our fallen brothers. Make a list of all of them and record them in the file. Seal up their wills and belongings. After the war, report to His Majesty and ask for more compensation. Let the brothers rest in peace and rest in the afterlife with a smile." Yes. The Steel Cavalry has contributed greatly in this war. Tally up the achievements and report them to me as well. Yes. Return to the troops. Fu Baoguo commanded. 27,000 men of the Steel Cavalry moved at the same time. However, at the next moment, everyone froze with an unusually complicated expression. They froze. They had not noticed it just now, but it was only now that they realized that more than 27,000 men from the Steel Cavalry had returned from the war. This was not wrong. In spite of this, there were more than 29,000 warhorses that had returned. In other words, there were still about 2,000 ownerless warhorses in the formation. Each of them stood where they were, bewildered and helpless. Chapter 456. Previously, with a spurt of energy, the horses were also focused and courageously galloped, following the troops all the way back. It was only now that they felt that something was amiss. There were still many companions of the same species around them, but they were not aware of it. Now that the surviving Steel Cavalry had returned, the masterless warhorses were at a loss, their heads swaying left and right as they searched for their companions in fear. Am I not carrying the burden of my old comrade whom I have always been so close to? What? Why aren't you riding me? Where have you gone? The warhorses neighed in bewilderment, stomping their hooves anxiously, hoping to find the face they were most familiar with in the crowd. Suddenly, a warhorse let out a long neigh and stood up on its hind legs. It turned its head and looked around, clearly trying to find its master. However, its eyes were filled with more and more fear, sorrow, and desolation. After some time, more than 2,000 warhorses neighed in anguish at the same time. When the sound fell into everyone's ears, they could not help but feel a heart-wrenching sorrow. Fu Baoguo lowered his head in dejection. The 20,000 Steel Cavalry who had gathered and returned to the troop bit their lips tightly, keeping quiet as tears glistened in their eyes. Even the formation of the Steel Cavalry, which had never been disorderly, was a little disorganized. Many of the warhorses, carrying the empty saddles on their backs, began to move uncontrollably. The horses' noses twitched as they looked around in vain, searching for their companions, their masters. That kind of blankness, sorrow, and loneliness was truly mournful, a sight that struck one's heart with grief. Suddenly, a long neigh rang out. A warhorse left the troop, carrying the empty saddle on its back and sprinting towards the battlefield like an arrow. The warhorse was sentient, obviously wanting to return to where its master had left it. It wanted to search for him, find him, be with him again, and carry him for eternity. With this warhorse leading the way, hundreds of other warhorses left the troop and galloped after it. The long mane on the horses' necks swayed in the wind, but it was filled with determination and solemnity. Stop them? Wang Dinghua was taken aback and hastily shouted. We can't stop them anymore. Fu Baoguo shook his head dejectedly and said, They won't be coming back. The neighing of the warhorses echoed on the battlefield for a long time. On the other side, Dongxuan's troops were cleaning up the battlefield. Hundreds of warhorses charged over, completely ignoring the enemy's silhouettes as they searched carefully among the mess. They were so attentive and so duty-bound. Catch them. A deputy general in Dongxuan's army was overjoyed when he saw it. These were all steel cavalry warhorses, and any one of them was a fine steed that could only be picked out of 1,000. Such a large group of ownerless warhorses suddenly appeared. Isn't this a windfall from the sky? I struck it rich. Dongxuan's deputy general, eager to hunt, immediately took a step forward and sprinted towards a horse that was obviously of the highest quality. With this person as an example, many Dongxian soldiers swarmed forward at once. Wait. When a middle-aged general saw this from afar, he knew something was wrong, but it was too late to stop him. Moreover, even if they had heard him, the soldiers who only had the desire to obtain a fine steed would not have bothered with him. At least hundreds of Dongxian soldiers had already charged forward, entangling themselves with the horses. This one is mine. Ah, mine. Mine? The hundreds of warhorses were searching for their companions with all their might. How could they hold it in when they were suddenly pulled and even ridden? They were unprecedentedly agitated, jumping around in a frenzy. With a long neigh, a warhorse that had been stolen onto its back leaped and bit as it charged towards Dongxuan's formation like it had gone mad. The horse's head was obviously slanted by the reins, but its eyes were filled with madness that had lost all sense of reason. Its speed was as fast as lightning. No matter what was in front of it, it only knew how to charge. All the warhorses neighed in agony, leaping and galloping madly. Jump down. Jump down quickly. Jump down quickly if you don't want to die. The Dongxian general roared in terror from afar, stomping his feet. These newbies really knew nothing. On the battlefield, who would dare provoke a warhorse that had lost its master? Such provocation was no different from courting death. These warhorses had already been destined to die. They had returned to the battlefield to die for their master. Life and death were no longer a consideration for these loyal warhorses. Jumping down from a galloping warhorse was extremely dangerous and could easily injure their tendons and bones, but it was still better than dying. It was just that many of the soldiers who had climbed onto the warhorses did not even have the time to jump down. The warhorses galloped like lightning and the outcome was decided in an instant. Some of the warhorses crashed headfirst into the huge tree stumps. Not only did they break their tendons and bones from the impact, the soldiers on the horses were buried along with them. Some crashed headfirst into the surrounding rocks, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The strong inertia sent the riders flying, bleeding from the fall. There were even more warhorses that charged into Dongxuan's formation in a frenzy, kicking and biting, destroying with all their might until they fell under Dongxuan's sabers and swords. However, it was only these hundreds of frenzied warhorses that had caused thousands of Dongxian soldiers to be injured or killed. With a long neigh, the leader of Dongxuan's shadow cavalry charged over on a tall black horse, cursing loudly. Who asked them to tame these warhorses? Are they king courting death? They're already on the battlefield and they don't even have this bit of common sense? A bunch of stars. The leader of the shadow cavalry roared like thunder. The most effective way to deal with the ownerless warhorses was to shoot them down with arrows. All other countermeasures were costly and the loss outweighed the gain. A general came out from the army with a darkened expression and a saber in his hand, saying furiously, "Sacrificing yourself to show your loyalty? Your father is going to eat these beasts. All of you shall be crushed into pieces, not even your bones will be left." The leader of the shadow cavalry was enraged, lashing the dark-faced general several feet away with a whip as he hollered, "How dare you? Such loyal warhorses and you want to eat their flesh. Are you still human?" He was not willing to let it go after that, hopping off his horse and starting another round of frenzied beatings. There were tears glistening in his eyes. "Clean up these warhorses and bury them with all the Yutang soldiers who have died in the war." The leader of the shadow cavalry heaved a long sigh. There were still a few warhorses that were not dead yet, still twitching and whining on the ground. The desolation in their cries was heart-wrenching. The leader of the Black Knights sighed and walked over with large strides. He gently caressed the neck of the dying warhorse and softly comforted it. However, the steel blade in his hand was cleanly inserted into the warhorse's heart to send it off. "Go in peace. Your master is waiting for you underground. You can ride side by side again, never to be separated again." He stood up, still trembling with rage as he hollered, "Why doesn't anyone know about this military taboo? Why do they still want to violate it? Whose soldiers are these? Reply to your father." His angry roar echoed in the air, filled with grief and indignation. Are you waiting for us to die so that you can come and steal our loyal warhorses as well? Are you going to eat our loyal warhorses as well? Isn't that right? The Shadow Cavalry and the Steel Cavalry were both lethal weapons on the battlefield. They were the continent's top cavalry. They had always regarded each other as their strongest opponent, and also their only opponent. At this moment, they could empathize with the fate of these masterless Steel Cavalry warhorses as if they were experiencing it themselves. On Yutong's side, banners fluttered in the wind. Tens of thousands of soldiers saluted solemnly. Warhorses, the souls of their heroes, remain. May they carry their masters to the afterlife, never to be separated again, to be together forever. The war between the two countries involved billions of people. Whether they were initially humble or arrogant, they could not escape from this whirlpool. Hidachui was the leader of the Raven Wind Gang. The Raven Wind Gang was a group of bandits that gathered in one place, roaming the eastern border all year round. Whether it was Dongshan or Yutong, as long as the Raven Wind Gang was wealthy, they would rob them. Although Hidachui was born in Yutong, he was the son of a mountain blacksmith. He was illiterate and did not know a single word. It could be said that he had no faith in his country or his people. After his father passed away, he relied on his superhuman strength to muddle through every day, robbing for a living. Slowly he had become the leader of the bandits. Relying on their superior equipment, their 800 brothers were all skilled. They rarely made mistakes in trades that did not require capital, so their days were not bad. They could be said to be carefree. It was also because they did not care about nationality, did not care about right or wrong. They would not let go of any passing merchants or passers-by. That was why they were called the Eastern Borders Wolves. The citizens of both countries' borders hated this group of people, calling them wolf bandits. Hidachui had always been ashamed of the word wolf bandits, but because of the name he had studied the wolf pack's tactics. Each time they made a move, they would swarm in like a gust of wind from all directions and would disperse once they were done. They came and went like the wind, gathering and dispersing unpredictably. Whether it was Dongshan or Yutong, they had long wanted to get rid of this group of people. Alas, both countries had tried to encircle him multiple times, but he had escaped deep into the mountains each time, returning empty-handed in the end. However, following this wave of war, the bandits' days were getting worse. Dongshan carried out the strategy of fortifying the walls and clearing the fields, slowly pushing forward. Along the way all life was silent. On Yutong's side, they had built themselves into an impenetrable fortress, not budging an inch, not even the slightest bit of human presence leaked out. The extreme confrontation between both sides had resulted in a very realistic outcome. Hidachui and his 800 bandits were slowly feeling that their livelihood was in question. If this went on, they would be in deep trouble. For the past few days, he had brought a few of his brothers to patrol the vicinity of the battlefield carefully. He hoped to find a chance to do some business and rob something. If this went on, it would be inevitable that they would run out of resources. The bandits moved like the wind and rarely stocked up on resources. During this period of time, the resources that they had accumulated previously had been depleted. Hidachui felt like his stomach was going to collapse from hunger. Chapter 457. When Yutong's 30,000 steel cavalry had gone to war, Hidachui had been sprawled in the snow like a lizard in the forest nearby, watching the battle with his mouth agape and eyes wide open. The brutality and heroism of the battle had shaken Hidachui's heart, shaking him to the core and shaking him to the core. What a good man. Since that day, Hidachui had been full of praises for Yutong's steel cavalry, yearning to be one of them. In fact, there were many times when Yutong's steel cavalry's earth-shattering roars would echo in his mind. In his dreams, Hidachui would even dream of becoming a member of Yutong's steel cavalry, galloping on the battlefield together, bathed in blood together, roaring to shake the heavens and frightening the enemy. Slowly, a strange thought grew in Hidachui's heart. It was yearning, passion, and a little narrow-mindedness. A sudden thought came to him: if I were to lead my men to help the army in war, would I be just as ferocious, never to return? At a time like this, it would not be a problem to seek for military merit for one's birth and for everything else in the past. If he were to become an official because of this, it would be even more wonderful. Of course, Hidachui would never say the same to his own brothers. Brothers, I have something to discuss with everyone. Now that the country is in trouble, we are bandits, but we are still from Yutong after all. Now that our country is in trouble, we can't ignore it. I plan to help Marshal Fu the next time the two armies fight. Does anyone have any thoughts? If anyone disagrees, feel free to speak up. This is purely a matter of risking our lives. It's much more dangerous than what we've done in the past. Even I'm a little hesitant about it. I won't be offended if you speak up." The leaders looked at each other for a moment before someone spoke up. "Big brother, it's understandable that you have such thoughts. This is how we live anyway. We've never done anything good for our country in our entire lives. Now that the country is in trouble, it's our duty to fight for our country. Even if we lose our lives here, our lives won't be in vain. It's better than being known as a bandit." Their thoughts were soon unified. After all, everyone knew their position in the eyes of the people. If they could get rid of their reputation as bandits, of course they would be overjoyed, especially since they were confident in their abilities. They even felt that they might be able to defeat Yutong's steel cavalry if they were to fight one-on-one. They were confident that they could retreat unscathed even if they were to fight. Hidachui felt a little guilty. After all, his wishful thinking was to use the lives of his brothers as gambling chips in exchange for wealth and glory. How could there be no deaths in war? However, he was more excited than anything else. In his opinion, a bright future was just around the corner. After witnessing a few small-scale battles with his own eyes, Hidachui came to a conclusion. Yutong's steel cavalry and Dongshuan's shadow cavalry did not have an advantage when compared to his wolf-taken. Many of their cultivation bases were weaker than his brothers. If their numbers were equal, his wolf-taken would definitely emerge victorious. It was not impossible for them to win the battle outright or even win the battle outright. What kind of standard was that? What I need to do now is to wait for the right time. Once the battle begins, when both sides have similar numbers and are equally matched in combat power, the battle will definitely be in a stalemate. When that time comes, I'll join Yutong's side. It'll naturally be the last straw that breaks the camel's back. Not only can I help the army achieve victory easily, I can also use this to raise the wolf-taken's reputation. Who knows, I might even have a place in Yutong's military. If that's the case, then there's no need to take the risk. This is a great thing to do, a great thing to do. Hidachui made up his mind swiftly. For this reason, he even drank a few rounds of wine with his wolf-taken brothers, swiftly depleting the last of his reserves. Finally the day came. The opportunity that Hidachui had been waiting for had arrived. In fact, such opportunities were available every single day. Dongshuan's shadow cavalry had viewed the shadow cavalry's charge as a great humiliation. Since then, they had been fighting in front of the Fortress of Resilience every day, galloping like the wind on their steeds. All sorts of provocative actions were obvious. Yutong, on the other hand, had achieved a great victory and their morale was at its peak. Despite Fu Baoguo's strict military orders, there were still times when they could not hold back. Fu Baoguo would send a troop of cavalry to deplete Dongshuan's shadow cavalry's combat power when they were showing off their strength. It would be a pleasant surprise if they could gain something from it. Therefore, after the battle that day, both sides would engage in a battle or two almost every day. The battlefield where both sides fought had already turned into crimson frozen blocks from the continuous battle, stained with fresh blood. On this day, the shadow cavalry's verbal abuse had crossed the steel cavalry's bottom line. Both troops of cavalry, each numbering over 10,000 men, had submitted letters of blood to request for battle. No matter how helpless Fu Baoguo was, he had finally lifted the ban and ordered Wang Dinghua to hold the line personally, fighting before the Fortress of Resilience. Against Dongshuan's shadow cavalry, 20,000 cavalrymen, the shadow cavalry and the steel cavalry, were the top cavalry troops in Tianshan continent, the only two elite cavalrymen in the world. All of them wore the same black helmets and armor as they fought, causing the ground to tremble. Fu Baoguo stood at the top of the fort, looking worried. To be fair, Fu Baoguo did not wish to fight this battle. Although Yutong's steel cavalry was not Fu Baoguo's trump card, it was one of his trump cards. In order to boost morale, he had only used this trump card after multiple arrangements. The outcome was just as Fu Baoguo had expected. They had achieved a complete victory. Not only had they destroyed the enemy's morale, they had also boosted their own side's morale to its peak. There were many benefits to a boost in morale, but there was no such thing as a boon without any drawbacks in this world. A boost in morale had its drawbacks as well. The drawback was that a bunch of proud soldiers and valiant generals were not easy to restrain. Now that they had won a great victory, they felt that they were the best in the world. Faced with the enemy's challenge and the loser's provocation, it was like a spark thrown into oil. It would explode at the slightest touch. There was no way to hold it back. If he were to forcefully suppress it, it would undoubtedly dispel his soldiers' enthusiasm. It would be even more inappropriate. Therefore, Fu Baoguo had lifted the ban despite knowing that this battle was not beneficial to the overall war, allowing the steel cavalry to fight the shadow cavalry. He only hoped that his side would have the morale of a great victory and would not suffer too much. Watching as both sides engaged in battle, Fu Baoguo recalled the mantra of every new and veteran soldier in the Fortress of Resilience. 30,000 soldiers can beat 300,000 soldiers without a temper. They're nothing. What are you shouting about? Do you really think we're afraid of them? Yutong's soldiers were unprecedentedly confident, not understanding their marshal's difficulties and schemes. If it had been in the past, Fu Baoguo would have had plenty of ways to suppress such emotions. Now, however, the war that concerned the fate of Yutong's nation was imminent. Fu Baoguo could only temporarily suppress such confidence of victory. How could he possibly suppress it? Such a situation had also led to one thing: they had to fight when the enemy came at them during this period of time. Otherwise they would not be able to maintain and vent such high morale. They would deplete the overly high morale through battle, then use the sacrifice of their own soldiers to ignite their common hatred of the enemy. Such a battle was destined to be unavoidable. It was impossible to return to their previous defensive state. It was even more inadvisable. Watching the 20,000 cavalrymen fight with no regard for their own safety, Fu Baoguo's face was brimming with confidence, but his heart was filled with helplessness and bitterness. The 20,000 cavalrymen battle between Yutong's steel cavalry and Dongshuan's shadow cavalry was fought with the best of the best. They were all fighting with no regard for their own safety, in order to reclaim the title of the world's top cavalry. As far as the eye could see, everything within a 500-mile radius was the battlefield of this battle. Galloping hoofs could be seen everywhere, the glint of swords and sabers could be seen everywhere. The steel cavalry's morale was obviously higher, but the shadow cavalry had also launched an extreme tactic of fighting with their lives on the line. On the battlefield, the clash of the two torrents did not slow down, instead it was picking up speed. It was as if heavenly lightning had ignited the fires of the earth as they collided with a loud bang. Both sides maintained their forward stance and did not retreat even half a step, not even the slightest bit. They allowed the flesh and blood on the ground to pile up layer after layer. In their eyes there was only each other. As they broke through each other's formations, they whipped their horses around and launched another attack. Such an extreme battle was the dumbest tactic, but it was also the most passionate. The manliest tactic. Both sides were fighting with their lives on the line. The top of Yutong's Fortress of Resilience was cheering while Dongshuan's army was cheering as well. More than 1 million people were cheering at the same time, causing the battlefield to be a chaotic mess. Those who were involved in the battle could no longer hear what the people around them were shouting. They were only shouting at the top of their lungs. After today's battle, Yutong will still have the upper hand and their morale will not falter. But this kind of depletion is too cruel. Fu Baoguo thought to himself, Dongshan has an abundance of soldiers, so of course they can afford it. On the other hand, even if we have the upper hand, we can't afford it. That's why we have to think of another way to reduce our energy consumption. We have to injure the other party while not injuring us. However, this is easier said than done. What kind of tactic should I use to hold Han San's 2 million troops back with the limited combat power we have? Fu Baoguo was still deep in thought when his gaze suddenly froze, looking in the direction of the faraway forest in disbelief. His mouth was agape, his jaw almost dislocated. What is that? In the dense forest, a troop of cavalry suddenly appeared. There were no more than 1,000 people at most. The entire troop rushed out like a sharp arrow towards the battlefield where the two sides were fighting. Dongshan did not move. Yutong did not move either. Where did this cavalry come from? What was his purpose for coming here? Was he friend or foe? First watch. Chapter 458. The troop's speed was incredibly fast as well, even surpassing Yutong's steel cavalry and Dongshuan's shadow cavalry in terms of speed. When the troop came closer, Fu Baoguo was even more shocked when he saw the other party's appearance. This group of people did not even have armor, they were only dressed in leather robes. They were oddly shaped and some of them were even dressed in rags that barely covered their bodies. However, it was such a troop that had joined the battle in an unexpected manner, roaring and yelling. Their target was actually Dongshuan's shadow cavalry. What the F***ck is going on? Marshal Fu was genuinely confused. The two top-notch cavalry troops of the world were clashing against each other, yet 1,000 bandits had joined the battle? Where did these fellows get their guts from? That action was clearly courting death? They are the Wolf Bandits. A deputy general beside him was also surprised. The Wolf Bandits have never cared about right or wrong, they don't care about identity or background. They rob whoever they see without exception. They are also the target that both our countries and our enemies want to eliminate. Why are they helping us fight this time? Moreover, they charged straight into the Black Knight's formation. This is simply courting death. Wolf bandits? They are the wolf bandits? Fu Baogua's mouth was agape. For a moment he did not know what to say. Fu Baogua had heard of this band of bandits that only existed in legends, but to him, they were nothing more than a minor nuisance that was not worthy of an army to annihilate. Thus he had let them be. There were only a few of them, so even if they committed a crime, they would not be able to cause too much of a commotion. When the battle ended, they could simply send an army to annihilate them. However, their actions now, even if they were to help Yutong's steel cavalry, was it not a little too strange? What was going on? Who could help me sort this out? Even if they are from Yutong and have the intention to serve the country, this is too impulsive, too thoughtless, too foolish. Fu Baogua murmured, is the leader of the wolf bandits only a brute? Fu Baogua's guess was right. Hidachui was indeed a brute. He was illiterate, and the thing he did the most in his life was to be brave and ruthless. In the past, he would listen to the wolf bandits' military advisor. However, this time he believed in what he saw with his own eyes. He believed that his side's combat power was enough to lock down the battle. Only then did he enter the battle. If one had to say that something was strange, it would be the wolf bandits' military advisor. This person did not stop him from courting death, but instead followed him into the army formation. It was also because of this that Hidachui was certain that his decision was extremely wise and far-sighted. But at this moment, Hidachui, who had just joined the battle, regretted it in less than 10 breaths. He regretted it so much that his intestines turned green. It turned out that watching from afar and personally participating in the battlefield were two completely different things. They weren't the same thing at all. The cultivation base of each of his brothers was indeed higher than that of any shadow cavalry or steel cavalry. Even in terms of individual movement speed, the wolf bandits had the upper hand. Even in terms of the explosive power of their horses, the wolf bandits were not at a disadvantage. All of these were correct. Hidachui did not see wrongly, nor did he make a wrong judgment. The only mistake in his judgment was that after they entered the battle formation, they suddenly realized that what they thought was just what they thought. It was all insignificant. Their higher cultivation base was, at most, just a fart. One-on-one, the wolf bandits were undeniably invincible against the shadow cavalry and steel cavalry. 3 against 3, the wolf bandits could still win completely. The shadow cavalry and steel cavalry could try their luck and join forces against one person. Perhaps they could take one person's life. If it was 10 against 10, the wolf bandits would still have the upper hand in the battle. There was a high chance that half of the wolf bandits would be killed and the cavalry would be annihilated. However, when it came to a battle of 100 men, the wolf bandits would definitely lose. Their only chance of survival would be to escape using their movement speed that was faster than the two cavalries. As for the 1,000-man battle that Hidachui had imagined, there would indeed be a great victory or even a complete victory. Yes, it would be one of the two cavalries who would win completely. The 1,000-man wolf bandits would not be able to escape the fate of being annihilated. As for the large-scale battle before him, the wolf bandits had no way of defending themselves. They could only be slaughtered. Yes, they could only be slaughtered. Hidachui had imagined that he would be able to create an imbalance in the battle formation with his first move, thereby achieving great feats, but that did not happen. The only thing he saw was, the moment his 800 brothers charged into the battle formation, in less than 10 breaths' time, 1/3 of them were gone. He blinked his eyes in disbelief. When he looked again, he realized that there were less than 200 survivors left on the Blue Island. This was too fast. They did not even have the chance to make a move. The moment they entered the battle, the enemy's weapons attacked them from all directions, and there was also a rain of arrows that rained down on them. The wolf bandits fell off their horses, and those who fell off their horses were immediately trampled into meat paste. The shadow cavalry did not suffer any losses. Hidachui felt as if he had been hit by a huge hammer, and he felt dizzy for a moment. At this moment, a wolf bandit who was dressed like a scholar rode a horse with a frail body, waving a long sword as he charged towards them. There were 3 other people beside him, guarding him as they charged towards him. They were the wolf bandits' military advisor and the other 3 leaders. They were the few with the highest cultivation base among the wolf bandits, aside from Hidachui. That was why they had managed to survive until now. However, by the time they reached Hidachui's side, there were only 2 of them left. One of them had his left shoulder sliced off, and it was unlikely that he would survive. "Big brother, let's go." The military advisor waved his sword, and sword light flashed, displaying an unusual power. The surrounding shadow cavalry could not stop him, but his face was abnormally red. It was obvious that he had used some kind of secret technique to activate his life force. Although he could show off for a while, it would not last long. When his life force was depleted, it would be the end of his life. "Big brother, hurry up and enter the pass." The military advisor shouted hoarsely. "With what happened today, the wolf bandits will be annihilated, and Big brother can expect to marry and have children in the future. Just don't forget to burn incense for us." Hidachui felt as if he had been struck by lightning, and his eyes widened. How did you know?" His heart was trembling. The plan in his heart. The military advisor smiled sadly. "We all know what Big brother is thinking. But the war between the two countries has begun, and the wolf bandits will be annihilated sooner or later. Even if they are not all killed, they will all starve to death. If we can use our lives to exchange for a golden path for Big brother, we are all willing." Hidachui's body swayed again and he almost fell off his horse. He shouted frantically, "You all know this, and yet you still came to die." Before he could finish his sentence, he was at a loss and could not speak any more. At the same time, a rain of arrows rained down, landing right where Hidachui was. Hidachui had lost his composure, and his heart was at a loss. He did not try to defend himself, and was about to become a porcupine or a porcupine. The absent-minded Hidachui suddenly felt his vision darken. It was the leader who had lost an arm, and he had thrown himself at Hidachui, blocking the rain of arrows for him. His whole body was immediately pricked like a porcupine, and his eyes were still fixed on Hidachui. "Big brother, run quickly. Our brothers are fighting with our lives. Just for Big brother's future. We're going to die anyway. Don't let us down." His voice stopped abruptly, and the leader's body trembled and he fell off his horse. Only his eyes were still staring at Hidachui anxiously, but they gradually lost their spirit. However, countless cavalrymen came rumbling over, drowning his anxious gaze. Hidachui fought with all his might and fought with all his might, just to see his brother one more time. However, after he survived the charge of the cavalrymen, all he could see was a pile of rotten flesh. Countless sabers, swords, spears, and arrows were still flying toward Hidachui without stopping. The Shadow Knights hated the horse bandits to the core. Hidachui's plan that day could be said to be one wrong move, and the whole game would be lost. However, there was one thing he was right about, and that was that their participation in the battle had ultimately affected the overall situation. Although the horse bandits were completely wiped out, it was like Hidachui's imagination, and they had successfully disrupted the formation of the Shadow Knights. The Steel Cavalry took this opportunity to massacre the horse bandits, and they already had a great advantage. They were about to turn this advantage into a victory and win. Both the Steel Cavalry and the Shadow Knights knew this was a foregone conclusion, and there was no turning back. It was only a matter of time. Therefore, the Shadow Knights naturally hated the horse bandits who had invaded without permission. They had to kill all the horse bandits before they were completely wiped out, or else how could they rest in peace? Especially the leader of the horse bandits before them. They would not rest until he was dead. The horse bandit advisor was still waving his sword with all his might, and he continued to use his remaining life force to protect Hidachui as they rushed out. Hidachui waved his hammers as tears streamed down his face. "That's what I planned, but I didn't expect everyone to die so tragically in this battle. I thought at least 80% of my brothers would follow me into the pass, and we would turn from bandits to soldiers together. But now there were only 2 of us left." With a roar, the military advisor's eyes revealed a look of despair. A black spear ruthlessly pierced into the military advisor's stomach and came out from his back. The advisor grabbed the spear with one hand and chopped off the head of the soldier with the black spear. Then he stabbed the sword into the butt of Hidachui's warhorse and hissed, "Hurry up and go. Remember, don't act on your own in the future. Listen to orders and everything." Before the military counselor could finish his last sentence, a saber chopped his right hand. Then, 3 spears stabbed into his body at the same time. Chapter 459. However, the bandits' advisor's desperate efforts were effective. Hidachui's warhorse was stabbed by his sword, and it galloped away with an unprecedented burst of energy, actually escaping the battle. Hidachui tried desperately to rein in his warhorse but to no avail. He could only let the tears in his eyes flow freely. Brothers? For the first time in his life, Hidachui understood the meaning of the word brothers. So this is what it means to be brothers. But when I understand it, I no longer have any brothers. The fortress of resilience was already in sight. Hidachui, who had yet to regain his composure, suddenly heard someone yell from the gate, "Open the gate, let him in." The thick gate opened abruptly. Hidachi's eyes were still streaming with tears. His tears had already turned red, they were tears of blood. At this moment he deeply regretted his own selfishness. What future did he want? A bunch of brothers who had been living happily with him in the forest had died for him. The words of the military counselor and his brothers before they died flashed in his mind like a bolt of lightning. "Big brother, in the future you can have a wife and children. Don't forget to burn incense for us in the future." Big brother, the brothers, "No. We're going to die anyway. Let's use our lives in exchange for a golden path for Big brother. Everyone is willing." The third chief, who was riddled with arrows, said before he died, "Brothers, charge forward with our lives, for Big brother's future. Go quickly," the military counselor roared before he died. "Go." Hidachi suddenly roared into the sky and wailed maniacally. "Enter the fort quickly. The gate will close if you don't enter now," someone urged sternly. The Fortress of Resilience's gates could not be opened easily. If the Wolf-Taken had not joined the battle and secured the Steel Cavalry's victory, the gates would not have been opened so easily. However, Hidachi had yet to enter the fort, so the people inside were naturally anxious. They did not know that delays could lead to unforeseen changes. What if something unexpected happened? However, Hidachi still had not entered the pass despite the continuous urging from the other end. He suddenly turned his horse around and roared, "Brothers, when we reach the netherworld, we are still the Wolf-Taken. We come and go like the wind, we come and go without warning. I'm coming." Just as his two hammers smashed the heads of two cavalrymen, his entire body was pierced by more than 10 spears. Hidachi was bleeding from his 7 orifices. Suddenly he cracked his mouth and laughed. "I'm coming. I've never been so happy in my life." Hidachi was dead. All his life he yearned to live in the light of day. All his life he hoped to get rid of the Wolf-Taken name and become a normal person. He wanted to become a person of status and bring honor to his ancestors. Yet, when he saw hope, when hope was right in front of him and within reach, when the guards approved of him and allowed him to enter, he gave up. He gave up without hesitation. Once they entered the pass, they would no longer be Wolf-Taken. From now on he was a military officer. As long as he didn't die, his future would be bright. But after all, he did not enter. No one knew what he was thinking. Moreover, no one knew what he meant when he said, "I've never been so happy in my life." Perhaps he finally understood what it meant to be a brother. Or perhaps, as a man of Yutong, he had finally fought for the country. In spite of this, his body was annihilated among the thousands of cavalrymen. No one cared about what he said anymore. The Wolf-Taken were annihilated. With Hidachi's death, the battle gradually came to an end. The battle between the two cavalrymen had ended. Yutong's Steel Cavalry was left with less than 3,000 men. Dongxuan's 10,000 Shadow Cavalry had been annihilated. Fu Baogua stood with his back straight. No one knew what he was thinking. Only Fu Baogua himself knew that he had suddenly understood something in that instant. "I know now. I know how to deal with Han Sanha now. Even if this method can't guarantee victory, it can at least buy us some time. Hold on until the 9 Supremes Lords come to our aid." Fu Baogua said, "We must find the Wolf-Taken leader's corpse later and bury him with military honors. This person has contributed greatly to this battle. He can't be buried." Fu Baogua said. "Contributed greatly?" Everyone was perplexed and unable to find an answer. In their eyes, the Wolf-Taken were a bunch of idiots who had come to die. How could they have contributed greatly? Could it be that the marshal was referring to them using their lives to disrupt the Shadow Cavalry's formation? Contributed greatly from there? If that was the case, it would make sense. But Fu Baogua turned to walk back, ignoring the nagging of the generals beside him. Right now, he felt as if he had been enlightened. "I've been a marshal for so many years, my brain has actually become rigid." Fu Baogua thought to himself, "It's this Wolf-Taken that reminds me. Come and go like the wind, gather and disperse without warning. Swarm forward and scatter." Fu Baogua's eyes shone brighter. With the Steel Cavalry's strict discipline and the Wolf-Taken's roguish fighting style, they can unleash a terrifying combat power. It still needs to be perfected. Gather and discuss the military situation. Yes? 4 days later, Han Sanha's million-strong army finally arrived. Yutong's warriors stood at the top of the Fortress of Resilience's wall. Looking into the distance, they could see densely packed military camps and tents as far as their eyes could see. Flags fluttered in the wind as far as their eyes could see, covering the mountains and plains. Even when they tried their best, they could not see the end of it. It was a sea of people, a forest of camps. Dongxuan's reinforcements had arrived from the rear, boosting the morale that had been low. For a moment, the soldiers were strong and their horses were strong. They looked like they were going to conquer the fortress of resilience in one fell swoop. "Teacher, I failed to live up to your expectations." Zhang Gu had come to ask for forgiveness. This was the first thing he said when he arrived at the central tent. "Let's not talk about the fact that victory and defeat are common in a war. Let's talk about your defeat. Whether you lose to Tai Zheng or to Fu Baogua, it's not embarrassing. To you, it's a valuable experience and a good thing. I've never expected you to defeat those famous generals in one battle. If you really win, it's delightful, but it might not be a good thing for your future." Han Sanhe was unusually calm, as if he had already expected such an outcome. His words of comfort were sincere. The reason why Han Sanhe had come so slowly was to prepare for the sudden arrival of the 9 Supremes. This was his top priority. He dared not delay or be negligent. On the other hand, it was as he had said. He wanted Zhang Gu to take charge of the situation and gain experience. He had never hoped that Zhang Gu could defeat Fu Baogua and occupy the Fortress of Resilience before his army arrived. How could the title of Yutong's strongest youth be obtained so easily? His words were hurtful, but they were the truth in Han Sanhe's heart. Facing his beloved disciple, the person who would inherit everything from him in the future, he spoke his mind freely and went straight to the heart of the matter. "Zhang Gu, you have to know that Yutong's military leaders, Qiu Leng and Fang, are old now. The 2 main marshals of the army now are Tai Zheng and Fu Baogua. Facing Fu Baogua alone in such a battle is a rare experience for you." Han Sanhe said in a low voice. "Tai Zheng still has a weakness. Sometimes he relies on his martial prowess and sometimes he's reckless and reckless. However, Fu Baogua can be considered an all-rounder. He's experienced and prudent, rarely taking risks for luck. However, rarely taking risks doesn't mean that he can't. As long as the chance of victory is high enough, he won't hesitate when it's time to strike. The 30,000 steel cavalry's ambush is proof of this. This person is a difficult opponent." Han Sanhe smiled faintly and said, "However, all the famous generals in this world have their weaknesses. Fu Baogua is no exception. Perhaps I should say that his strength is also his weakness. He's too stable. Sometimes, being too stable can become a weakness that can be exploited." Zhang Gu bowed to listen to his teacher's teachings. At this moment, he suddenly had the urge to ask, since all the generals in this world have their weaknesses, what is teacher's weakness? Indeed, what was the weakness of Han Sanhe, the publicly acknowledged unrivaled general of this world? No one seemed to know yet. Perhaps it would be revealed in this battle? In the days that followed, both sides engaged in an even more intense battle than before. Han Sanhe personally deployed his troops to attack the Fortress of Resilience. There were many battles in a row, the battles exceptionally brutal. Both the offensive and defensive sides were clear. Yutong defended while Dongxian attacked. Yutong's army, who relied on the fort, naturally had the upper hand. The casualty ratio between both sides was maintained at 4-1. This meant that Yutong had the advantage of the terrain. One person could take 4 lives from the opponent. In spite of this, Han Sanhe did not mind. It was within his expectations. The Fortress of Resilience was the world's strongest fortress. It was easy to defend and difficult to attack. Furthermore, with Fu Baogua's steady management, the current situation was not unexpected. Furthermore, their military strength far surpassed Yutong's by a few times. Even if they were to expend their forces like this, they could still afford it. If they continued to attack like this, the enemy's morale would drop to rock bottom in at most 10 days. In 15 to 20 days, the Fortress of Resilience would fall. This was Han Sanhe's confidence. He was certain that his judgment would not be wrong. Han Sanhe had not planned to employ any other strategies or tactics right from the start. He would launch a direct attack and win with brute force. This was the most direct method that would result in the highest casualties, but it was also the most effective and targeted. It was especially effective against someone as stable as Fu Baogua. However, just like what Han Sanhe had said himself, all the famous generals in this world had their weaknesses. Han Sanhe was no exception. His weakness was perhaps his overconfidence. He had never expected that a person who had long hardened his character would undergo such a shocking transformation. As the saying went, a scholar who had been away for 3 days would be looked at in a different light. This time the person Han Sanhe had misjudged was Fu Baogua. He was shocked to realize that he did not seem to know Fu Baogua anymore. Chapter 460. To be more precise, Fu Baogua had changed. He was no longer the Fu Baogua of the past. Within Han Sanha's expectations, the only thing Fu Baogua should do when faced with Han Sanha's million-strong army was to defend with all his might and not lose. There was nothing else other than that. However, Fu Baogua's countermeasure was far more than that. The fortress of resilience had to be defended, impenetrable and as stable as a mountain. At the same time, however, Fu Baogua had also launched an action that was completely different from his usual marching style, a frenzied attack. Even Han Sanha found this method of attack troublesome. Fu Baogua's strategy was to deploy 100,000 steel cavalry. Indeed, 100,000 steel cavalry had been mobilized to shake Dongxian. Of course, these 100,000 steel cavalry were not going to attack Dongxuan's camp by force like the 30,000 steel cavalry had done previously. If they had done so, Han Sanha would have guffawed because it would not be a wise plan but a suicidal move. The 100,000 steel cavalry had been divided into 20 teams by Fu Baogua and dispersed into the vast forest. Once the armies engaged in battle or when Dongxuan's troops began to attack the city, they would be ambushed like a pack of wolves. These small groups of steel cavalry had truly accomplished these 16 words. They came and went like the wind, gathering and dispersing unpredictably. They swarmed forward and dispersed. This was the most orthodox way of fighting for the horse bandits. Now, after Fu Baogua had modified this tactic that had never been taken seriously by real cavalry, he had used the world's most elite steel cavalry to execute it. Whether it was day or night, as long as they saw an opportunity, they would appear and take a bite. They were well equipped and swift. After a single strike, whether it was a hit or not, they would flee far away, never lingering on the fight. It would be best if Dongxuan's troops who had suffered the attack chose to play it safe and not give chase. However, if they were bent on revenge and gave chase forcefully, not to mention whether they could catch up, who knew when another fresh troop would appear from another direction and leave immediately after the attack? If there were too many pursuers, they would inevitably be clumsy and unable to catch up. If there were too few of them, they might even be annihilated by the enemy. It would be wrong to pursue, but it was also wrong to not pursue. The steel cavalry, who had brought along sufficient rations, clean water, and arrows, galloped on the battlefield in a pervasive manner. They were indescribably arrogant. In just a few short days, Dongxuan's supply line had been attacked 5 times. Every time they would be attacked by a rain of rockets. Although the rations were not really intercepted, there were still some losses. The military camps at the borders of Dongxian would often catch on fire at night. Even if it did not turn into a huge fire, at the very least, the camp that was caught in the fire would not be able to avoid a night of no rest. Think about it, Dongxuan's troop had been fighting for a whole day. The men and horses were fatigued, and they had not slept for the whole night. How could they stand it? Even if the above did not harm his corps, it was still a headache for Han Sanha. It was not that Han Sanha did not set up traps and ambushes to lure the steel cavalry into them, but for some reason the soldiers did not fall for it at all, refusing to fall into the trap no matter what. It was as if they knew that the enemy camp that looked safe and could be taken down with a single strike was actually filled with endless ambushes and fatal traps. Faced with such a situation, even a veteran general like Han Sanha could not help feeling that Fu Baogua must be King crazy. How could he be so ferocious? Was this still Fu Baogua? Which god had awakened such a chakra for Fu Baogua? Han Sanha's head was at least 2 times bigger than usual. 5,000 men a troop. Return to the city to resupply every 3 days. All movements are autonomous. There is only one goal, to weaken Dongxuan's combat power. Requirement: when moving at night, the hooves of the horses must be wrapped in cotton wool to ensure that their movements are minimal. They are not allowed to advance recklessly. Requirement: in each battle, the casualties on our side must not exceed 10 men. Requirement: only when the war horses have sped up can they attack. After the first strike, they must retreat immediately no matter the outcome. Requirement: do not engage in a head-on battle or force your way into the battle, no matter how good the opportunity is. Requirement: only harass and weaken them. No annihilation is allowed. Even if they are facing a troop of 100 men, they must retreat immediately after the war horses have sped up and a volley of arrows. Requirement: even if they see their comrades being ambushed in front of them and are about to be wiped out, those who are ambushed are not allowed to ask for help. Those who witness the ambush are not allowed to save them either, they must stay away at once. Then look for a chance to weaken the enemy. Requirement: even if they only need to turn around and save their comrades from certain death, they are not allowed to turn around. Requirement: even if they see the fortress of resilience being breached, they are not allowed to provide aid. Requirement: every person must bring back a piece of nightmare stone and a piece of rolling log during every resupply, in exchange for supplies and arrows. Every time there is a resupply, if more than 50 men are killed within 3 days, the leading general will be beheaded. The assistant general will be beheaded. Disband the troops and rebuild after disruption. For those who violate the above requirements, the leading general will be beheaded and the assistant general will be beheaded. Disband the troops and rebuild after disruption. This was Fu Baoguo's request when the steel cavalry moved out. It was a temporary battlefield discipline. His orders were strictly enforced, and his words were the law, eliminating all hidden dangers before they could occur. The steel cavalry's wolf pack tactic was effective, giving Han Sanha a headache. However, it was only a minor detail and did not affect the overall situation much. The key to the war was still the Fortress of Resilience's success and failure. The war between both sides was getting more and more intense. As the days passed, the Fortress of Resilience seemed to be teetering on the brink of collapse, but it held on each and every day. Another siege battle ended. Fu Baoguo stood at the top of the fort as usual, watching his assistant generals anxiously commanding the repair of the fort wall, moving supplies and transporting wounded soldiers, but he did not budge. The general was the soldier's courage. The marshal was the army's soul. Although Fu Baoguo did not do anything, as long as he stood there steadily, Yutong's army would have a backbone. Fu Baoguo had not slept for 3 days and 3 nights, but he still looked full of energy and vigor. He gave others boundless confidence. With Marshal Fu here, the Fortress of Resilience was Yutong's. No one could take it away. Not even Han Sanha could do it. Fu Baoguo stood at the top steadily, his gaze fixed on the white clouds in the sky. There was only one thing on his mind now. I've used all my trump cards and exerted all my strength. I'm afraid I can't hold on much longer. Yutong has almost 10,000 casualties every day. This loss of combat power isn't something that can be compensated with fighting spirit and morale. 9 Supremes Lords, the only hope of this war lies on you. When will you be able to come? I hope to see you one last time, to tell you that you weren't wrong that day. Fu Baoguo is no longer that selfish, despicable man. Report. Marshal, the fort's repair is complete. Good. Everyone rest on the spot and recover your stamina as much as possible. Yes? Looking at the exhausted warriors resting, Fu Baoguo stood up straight and suddenly guffawed. Brothers, do you know what this marshal is thinking now? A deputy general chimed in. May I ask what the marshal is thinking? Fu Baoguo guffawed and said, I'm thinking that Han Sanha is known as the god of war, the top general acknowledged by the world. His military force is a few times more than ours, but there's still no progress after such a long time. We've always been as steady as a mountain, unshakable. Say, don't you think this god of war doesn't live up to his name? Fu Baoguo said loudly. Ha ha. The warriors guffawed, inexplicably feeling that the other side's million-strong army was led by the god of war himself to attack the Fortress of Resilience. They had so many advantages, but they still couldn't take it down after such a long time. It's hard to live up to his reputation. Right now, I truly feel embarrassed for Han Sanha. Think about it, how long has it been since I've been on the battlefield? My personal combat power is only SOSO, but Han Sanha can't do anything to me. Doesn't this already speak volumes? Fu Baoguo's laughter boomed like thunder. To raise morale, Fu Baoguo had resorted to every conceivable means, even resorting to self-destructive tactics. However, the effect was obvious. Everyone's ears were filled with cheers. Even the exhausted soldiers felt a wave of pride and could not help puffing out their chests. Of course, no one would take Fu Baoguo's personal combat power seriously. Come to think of it, it's not a shame that Han Sanha couldn't take down the Fortress of Resilience. At least, I think it's within reason. Fu Baoguo's eyes gleamed coldly. After all, it's I, Fu Baoguo, who's guarding this place. With me, Fu Baoguo, here, what can 10 gods of war do to me, let alone one Han Sanha? Fu Baoguo's voice was like thunder, deafening to the ears. Marshal. Mighty. Countless Yutong warriors roared, their blood boiling. No one thought that Fu Baoguo's words were incoherent or contradictory. After all, everyone knew, especially the veterans, that perhaps Marshal Fu was the top man in Yutong's military today. He might not just be the best of the younger generation. Fu Baoguo guffawed at the sky, looking proud and confident that the world was within his grasp. In spite of this, he was calling out anxiously in his heart, Lord Supreme Wind, when can you come? The Empire of Yutong, Tiantang City. Qiu Jinhan had not slept or rested for the past few days. He was busy reorganizing the new troops, allocating resources and sending reinforcements. All sorts of matters, big or small, had to go through his hands before he could be at ease. He dared not slack or be negligent. Actually, it was not only Marshal Qiu. The entire imperial court of Yutang's imperial court was swamped with work. Even when His Majesty and old Marshal Qiu were free, they could only frown, unable to express their emotions. Chapter 461. The order of the previous chapter was wrong. It should have been 157, but the editor had gone to sleep. This one was 158 according to the normal order. His Majesty and old Marshal Qiu asked each other several times a day. The old Marshal and His Majesty were well aware of the fact that Supreme Wind was actually Supreme Cloud all along. The original Supreme Wind would never have been able to do what he was doing now. Only Supreme Cloud, the Nine Supremes think tank, would have had such a plan and could see the bigger picture. However, since Supreme Cloud did not show his true face and used the identity of Supreme Wind as a disguise, there must be a deeper meaning to it. Yutang naturally had to help him conceal it. However, the whole world might already know that the Supreme Wind who had reappeared was actually Supreme Cloud. From now on, there was no need to hide it anymore. Some time ago, Yutang's higher-ups had received news that the Empire of Zio had set up layers of stratagems to trap Supreme Cloud. When he received the news, His Majesty had almost fallen ill from anxiety. Fortunately, news came right after that. Supreme Cloud had wreaked havoc in Zilong City, fought a bloody battle with the army, broke through the siege and retreated unscathed. He had even triggered the Lunar River's waters to flood the Empire of Zio in front of Zilong City, threatening to force Zio's emperor and others to submit. His prowess had shocked the world. He had even brought back the remains of the Shangguan family of generals General Shangguan Wudi, allowing the family's heroic spirit to return. This news was like a soothing pill to the Yutang emperor who had been impatient at the time. He was beaming with joy, as if an acute illness had been cured in an instant. Furthermore, the Empire of Zio had retreated because of this incident, breaking away from the Four-Nation Alliance. This had greatly reduced the pressure on Yutang's front line. After confirming the situation, the order was immediately passed. Half of the western garrison was sent to reinforce the eastern defense, to fend off the powerful enemy Dongxian, and to deal with Han Sanhe together. A few days later, news of Lord Supreme Cloud reinforcing the southern front line and displaying his prowess in the southern border battlefield, repelling De Yuan's army in one fell swoop and stabilizing the southern border's defense was heard again. Yutang was filled with thunderous cheers, the people's hearts surging. The Nine Supremes were the Nine Supremes. Even if there was only one of them left, he would still be Yutang's guardian angel. With the Nine Supremes, Yutang had no worries. After Supreme Cloud had ended the southern border war, he had told the southern marshal that he would immediately depart for the eastern defense. This had relieved Yutang's emperor and the officials in the imperial court. With Supreme Cloud's assistance, even if the eastern defense could not counterattack, they would at least be safe. Who knew? From then on, there was no more information about Supreme Cloud. Supreme Cloud seemed to have vanished just like that. It was as if it had really turned into a cloud midway and didn't move at all. 20 days had passed since then. It would take at most a few more days for the troops that the Western Army had transferred to the east to reach the Fortress of Resilience. Lord Supreme Cloud, who had left earlier and possessed unparalleled speed, had not shown up at the eastern line. Not only was it strange, but it was also a bad omen. The battle in the east was in full swing, and it was so tragic that the land was red for tens of thousands of miles. However, Supreme Cloud was nowhere to be found. What's going on? How could there be no news at all? Even Zilong City's spiritual restraining formation is helpless against Supreme Cloud. What force in this world can keep him in check? Qiu Jinhan paced back and forth in the hall of the Board of War anxiously. On the other side, His Majesty was also pacing back and forth like an irascible lion. What happened? His Majesty's brows were knitted together. In these few days, there were even people who had begun to attack Supreme Cloud, saying that if Supreme Cloud had not been so stubborn and left Yutang for Zio, such a thing would not have happened. This was obviously a trap, but he had still jumped into it. He was obviously ignoring the nation's crisis. He was inhumane. Not only old Marshal Qiu, even His Majesty was infuriated by such remarks. Must one remain indifferent for the sake of the nation when their relatives and friends are kidnapped? Could it be that they have a heart of stone? What's more, it was still the period of the letter of credence. All the countries agreed that there would be no war before the new year. Such a letter of credence was announced to the entire Tianshan continent. Who would have thought that the four countries would tear it apart at the same time? What's more, it's the middle of winter when the snow has sealed off the mountains and roads. It's always been the time for the militarists to recuperate. Who would have thought that the war would come at this time? In spite of this, His Majesty heaved a long sigh in the end. He really had not expected it. Even he, Qiu Jianhan, Lung Daoyin, and the others had never thought that the letter of credence would be broken. This was a letter of credence that was witnessed by heaven's will, a letter of credence that was connected to the continent's providence. Did those monarchs not want to live anymore? Heavy panting could be heard as a soft bag was carried in. On it, old Grand Commandant Fang Qingtian lifted half of his body anxiously. Is there any news of Supreme Cloud? His eyes were filled with fervent anticipation. The old Grand Commandant, who was like a candle in the wind, was still worried and had ordered someone to carry him over. Qiu Jianhan shook his head silently. Disappointment and dejection flashed across the old Grand Commandant's eyes. He murmured, although no news is good news, I still want to know Supreme Cloud's whereabouts now. As long as this old man knows, news of Lord Supreme Cloud. Even if it's not news of him rushing to the battlefield, this old man can die in peace even if I close my eyes now. His Majesty the Emperor's gaze was cold. Old Qiu, Supreme Cloud went missing on his way from the southern border to Dongxian this time. It's a mountain range that stretches for tens of thousands of miles. To be able to trap Supreme Cloud there, a murderous glint flashed across Qiu Jinhan's eyes. It can only be the Four Seasons Tower. It must be them. Only the Four Seasons Tower could send such an earth-shattering expert to trap Supreme Cloud now. Now we can be sure that something must have happened to Supreme Cloud. He must be fighting the Four Seasons Tower's experts now. It's just that we don't know if Supreme Cloud is only trapped or if his life is at risk. Qiu Jinhan's eyes were filled with worry. He did not want to say the last part. But where were you, Supreme Cloud? Critical military news. Lung Daoyin charged in. Dongxian has sent another 800,000 soldiers. They've been deployed in batches. The first batch of 300,000 is already on its way, the second batch has been assembled, and the third batch is being assembled. Has Han Sanhe gone mad? This is already the scale of a nation's destruction. If Dongxian doesn't fall in this war, it'll be the end of Yutang's reign. His Majesty and old Marshal Qiu's expressions changed at once. Even if Fu Baoguo's subordinates were to include the reinforcements he had sent out during this period of time and the martial artists who had volunteered themselves, there were only less than 500,000 men left. Even if half of the western border's military force had arrived, there would only be 150,000 men as reinforcements. To fight against 2,200,000 men with less than 650,000 men? Just this pressure was enough to make anyone go crazy from the pressure. Fu Baoguo was human as well. Could he be an exception? Lung Daoyin said loudly, Your Majesty, the new troops are about to complete their training. This old official requests for permission to head to the eastern defense and assist Fu Baoguo in defending the Fortress of Resilience. His Majesty the Emperor mused. The current situation was obvious. Fu Baoguo alone would not be able to hold the fort. A person's energy was limited. He would die of exhaustion. The enemy could rest in shifts, but there was only one pillar of support for the Fortress of Resilience. Fu Baoguo could not rest. Once the enemy's reinforcements arrived, it would be the time Fu Baoguo's life would end. It was necessary to send men and reinforcements. Under such circumstances, the military's general had to rush over to assist. In addition, this candidate's capability and reputation could not be lower than Fu Baoguo's. These two men were the Empire of Yutang's military stabilizing force. Once they went to the eastern border, they would be a great boost of morale. His Majesty the Emperor was about to agree to it. Wait. Qiu Jinhan's white beard fluttered as he spoke in a low voice. It's most suitable for me to go to the eastern defense. Lung Daoyin retorted angrily, Am I not suitable? Qiu Jinhan said, Old Lung, we know ourselves best. I've been stationed at the eastern defense for 20 years. I can almost remember every blade of grass and tree there. You've always roamed the south and the west, how can you be more familiar with the eastern border than I am? Tell me who's more suitable to go. Moreover, although I've been in the capital city all these years, I'm confident that my prestige at the eastern border is still there. It's as solid as a rock, indestructible. If I don't use it now, what am I waiting for? I'll let you say who's more suitable for the eastern border. Qiu Jianhan was merciless, his words unusually straightforward. Lung Daoying's face flushed red, but he compromised and said, "What you've said is reasonable, but an old man can't rely on his bones. Let me go. Old Qiu, you're older than me after all?" He looked at Qiu Jianhan worriedly. Everyone knew that Qiu Jianhan was indeed the most suitable person to go to the eastern border. However, looking at his head full of white hair, how could he bear to let the old general put on his armor and embark on his journey again? Especially when he was facing Han Sanhe, his military strength and combat power were both inferior. Qiu Jianhan said sternly, "Can't I kill Han Sanhe just because I'm older?" He turned around and said, "Your Majesty, this old official requests your command. Tomorrow morning I shall lead 200,000 men to the east." His Majesty looked deeply at his old comrade, his brother. He took a deep breath and finally said, "Good. Marshal Qiu shall go in this battle, but it's not 200,000 men. I'll gather another 100,000 men from the palace guards and the royal guards for you. If the border is unlucky, what's the use of the palace guards even if the royal guards are left?" Very well. The plan was finalized. "Your Majesty, if there's a day when you hear of this old official's defeat..." Qiu Jianhan sucked in a deep breath and said, "Please move the capital to the southern border immediately to preserve Yutong's vitality." His Majesty turned away, not saying a word. After a long while he said, "No need to say anything more. Yutong shall not perish." Lung Daoying came over hurriedly and said, "Old Qiu?" He choked on his words and said after a long while, "Take care." Qiu Jianhan laughed boldly and said, "If Dongxian doesn't retreat, this old man's old bones will truly be handed over to Han Sanhe." Saying that, he turned and strode away. That night, all the families in the country petitioned to join the war. Even the Shangguan family of generals was among them. The Lung family and the Qiu family came out in full force. Even the women with cultivation base mounted their horses, ready to depart. Shangguan Lingxiu had just returned and had requested to join the war immediately after asking for it, even gathering all of the Shangguan family's military force. 20,000 warriors who had been through hundreds of battles were ready to fight. In spite of this, the hearts of everyone in the empire of Yutong were heavy. The danger of this war had never been seen before. The eastern border was in a state of emergency. Dongxian had mustered the military force of a nation, gathering 2 million soldiers, a scale that could destroy a country. They even had a god of war, the world's top general, as their marshal. The entire Yutong was immersed in the atmosphere of an impending storm. Everyone was calling out anxiously in their hearts, "Supreme Cloud, where are you? I'm begging for monthly votes." Chapter 462. It was early in the morning on the day of the expedition. Shangguan Lingxiu could not help but make a trip to the residence of Heavenly Clouds. The residence of Heavenly Clouds had been completely rebuilt. Its size was almost twice as big as before. It was even more luxurious and high profile. The white jade capital in the heavens and the residence of Heavenly Clouds in the mortal realm? The difference was comparable to that of a real estate. It looked magnificent and one would like it from the bottom of one's heart. However, such a stunning residence seemed empty and devoid of any signs of life. After the new residence was completed, Dong Qianling, Chun Wanfeng, and the others each occupied a side yard, shamelessly making it their own home. Yun Yang had not returned and the owner was not around. Lao Mei would not chase the young master's guests away, so he could only allow the 4 fellows to stay. After the previous battle, Lao Mei had a whole new level of respect for Dong Qianling and the other 3 fellows. His attitude towards them was vastly different as well. If it was said that he was only concerned about his reputation and acting to keep up appearances before, he was now really treating the 4 of them like family and friends. The friendship that had been forged after going through a war together, a battle of life and death, was indeed extraordinary. If someone had told Lao Mei that he could become a true friend of the legendary spring, summer, autumn and winter young masters and that they would never abandon each other in life or death, Lao Mei would have spat on that person's face. Now he could only swallow his spit. The world was truly unpredictable. Most righteous people were those who butchered dogs, while most heartless people were scholars. This was indeed a well-known saying. However, the 4 popinjays were not those who butchered dogs either. Why were they so affectionate? How could Lao Mei justify his words? "It's so comfortable. This residence, King Hell, when your father lives alone after splitting from the family, I'll get a house like this. This is the perfect life." Dong Qianling shook his legs in satisfaction. The few remaining guards of the Dong family looked up at the sky. King Hell, this fellow was actually thinking of splitting from the family now. If the head of the family knew about this, all 3 of his legs would probably be broken. Also, even if you did split from the family, you wouldn't be able to afford a house like this. Just looking at the building materials alone, a side yard like this would definitely cost at least 30 to 50 million silver taels. Even if you emptied your family's assets to buy it, wouldn't you be able to live in the future? What's more, it's a waste for you to live in such a good house. Can you keep it? Maybe one day, there would be a high-level cultivator who coveted such a good man-made cultivation place and directly snatched it. This was all expected and reasonable. The 4 of them led a befuddled and carefree life in the residence of Yun with their guards. However, it had only been 4 days. They had probably just warmed up from sitting but had not even warmed up from their sleep when they were all grabbed by Qiu Jianhan. "You brats, follow me to war. Look at your fat and lazy bodies. I have to train for your father or else I'll have to do it in the future." The old marshal's eyes were bloodshot as he plotted for the sake of the Empire of Yutong's safety. He suddenly remembered that his nephew seemed to be in the capital. Moreover, that brat had a few playboy friends by his side. Moreover, there were quite a few fellows with high cultivations by their side. If he didn't capture them and use them, he would be going against his conscience. Naturally, he found a random reason to capture them all and enlisted them in the army. Although Dong Qianling and the other 3 fellows were reluctant, none of them dared to provoke him. Who was this old Marshal Qiu in front of them? He was someone that even Boss Yun had to be submissive to, the leader of Yutong's 3 infamous rogues. Since the old man had spoken, it was better for the few of them, who were merely small fries, to follow his orders. "Let me tell you, it's wartime now and Yutong is in danger. Do whatever you want. If you don't obey, you'll be punished according to military law." The old marshal glared. "What do you mean by military law? How is it military law?" Chun Wanfeng blinked his eyes in confusion. "We didn't say that we won't go, but what do you mean by military law?" "Military law means beheading. Simply put, beheading if you don't obey." Qiu Jianhan glared at them. When the 4 of them heard this, they were all shocked. F***ck, they were really playing with their lives. They immediately thought of retreating. No. We're not going, we're not soldiers, we, sob, change their clothes and take them all away." At Qiu Jianhan's command, a group of people charged in with menacing smiles and stripped the 4 fellows naked. Then they put on a military uniform for each of them. "Now that you've put on your uniforms, it's all over. You're all soldiers now." The old marshal was unreasonable. "Of course, we have to be punished according to military law if we're soldiers." The 4 of them looked like they were about to cry. F***ck, how could there be such a thing in this world? I've only heard of people being forced into prostitution, but now this is forcing people to enlist? This is forcing people to enlist in the army. Dong Qianling twisted his neck. "Old Master Qiu, can you be more reasonable? I'm not a member of the Qiu family. You can't control me. How dare you talk back to your superior? Do you know that this is a crime punishable by death? Since it's your first offense, I'll give you a light punishment. Men 10,000 military flogs." Dong Qianling was terrified. F***ck 10,000 military flogs? And this was just a light punishment. After that, there wasn't even a piece of flesh the size of a fingernail left on my body? He had truly experienced the true colors of a gangster now. The legendary leader of Yutong's 3 biggest gangsters lived up to his name indeed. He was a real gangster. In comparison, their titles as the 4 popinjays were at most child's play. There was no comparison. The difference was like heaven and earth. "Spare my life. This subordinate is willing to serve the country loyally, even if I have to die 1,000 times." Dong Qianling admitted defeat. "At least you know what's good for you. You lot don't know what's good for you. This old man is kind enough to give you an official position. Your ancestors should thank this old man, thank my 18 generations of ancestors. Let's go." Qiu Jianhan dragged Dong Qianling away by his ears. The other 3 men were escorted to enlist in the army as well, cursing Qiu Jianhan's entire family and even his 18 generations of ancestors along the way. An official position. Who the F***ck cares about it? Look at how benevolent and righteous you are. If my family were to find out about this, they would definitely beat you to death, you old fart. Forget about scolding your ancestors, the Qiu clan will never agree to it. Cursing was one thing, but it was clear that the situation was against them. The 4 of them could only submit to it. How did the saying go? Life was like being strengthened. One could only choose to enjoy it if one could not fight back. These 4 men were captured, while their guards could only follow them passively even if they were not captured. This was the inevitable outcome of a certain gangster's calculation. A bunch of peak realm cultivators would be a waste if they were left alone. It was only right to make use of them all. Thus, the residence of Yun was empty once again. Feng Mafei and Bai Yixue discussed with Lao Mei and followed Qiu Jianhan directly. Young master's lifelong wish is to protect Yutong. We're his guards, of course we have to go to the battlefield. Although we can't charge with the army, it's our duty to be Old Marshal's personal guards and protect his safety. These were their heartfelt words, and they told Old Marshal Qiu as well, expressing their willingness to be Old Marshal Qiu's personal guards for a period of time to come. Old Marshal Qiu was almost overjoyed that these two had come to help him. Old Marshal Qiu's understanding of a surmounting cultivator's power was relatively limited, but he knew that both of them were superb cultivators above 10th perfection, especially Bai Yixue, who was one of the world's top swordsmen. It was only natural that he was delighted to be able to survive the sword of the unrivaled sword lord Mo Yen. Although the evaluation of Bai Yixue was a little low and a little too high, it was still acceptable. Both of them were delighted. Actually, Lao Mei wanted to go as well. However, the residence of Yun needed someone to watch over it no matter how big it was. Therefore Lao Mei stayed. Then Lao Mei realized that he had returned to the state he was in a few years ago. The entire residence of Yun, the vast residence of heavenly clouds that was supposed to be the best place for cultivation, only had himself as the caretaker. Apart from that, there was no one else. The sudden silence made Lao Mei feel even more lonely. It was so lonely. Seeing Shangguan Lingxiu visit, Lao Mei was even a little surprised. There was finally someone to talk to, was there not? Any news from young Master Yun? Shangguan Lingxiu asked. No. Lao Mei sighed. Yunyang was different from Supreme Cloud. There were not many who would specifically ask about him at this juncture. After all, the title of Tiantong's top popinjay was still on someone's head. It was not a big deal for him to suddenly disappear for 10 days or even half a month. Unexpectedly, Shangguan Lingxiu, who heard the reply, turned to leave without hesitation. She left cleanly without hesitation. Lao Mei was taken aback. What did she mean? He could clearly see the anxiety and worry in Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes. However, is that all you said when you came? I haven't even opened my mouth yet. Can you give me some space to relieve my loneliness? No, Shangguan Lingxiu did not have the time now. Since there was still no news from the only person who might know Supreme Cloud's whereabouts in this world, it was better to prioritize national affairs and rush to the front line. In spite of it, Shangguan Lingxiu's trip was not entirely fruitless. She had gained 2 new soldiers under her. Both of them were slender and had long hair that cascaded down like a waterfall. Their silhouettes were beautiful and tempting. However, when one looked at their dark and misty faces, other than making one feel that they needed to be vigilant and ready to defend themselves at any time, there was only pity. Was it because the heavens were jealous of beauty and did not allow the world to have beautiful ladies? These 2 ladies were, of course, Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan. The 2 ladies were considered completely safe during this period of time. It was unknown why the 4 Seasons Tower's manpower had suddenly retreated. Lei Dongtian had already disappeared without a trace. The people from the 2 noble families had come a few times to search for the 2 ladies. They were anxious as well. They had accepted the betrothal gifts, but their daughters had suddenly gone missing. This matter had to be found. They had considered whether they should look for trouble with Lei Dongtian. After all, it was Lei Dongtian's strange way of courting that had caused them to run away. However, they had not made up their minds yet. After all, the 2 families would have to think long and hard before they could make a decision to offend someone like Lei Dongtian. In addition, this decision might turn out to be a cowardly one. However, their search was also aimless. After all, like Lei Dongtian, they knew that this place was the only place that Yi Lingxi was connected to. However, with the 9 Heavens dictum and the 2 ladies' disguises, the other party could not recognize them even if they were face to face. They could only scurry around like headless flies. It was one thing for the 2 ladies to be safe, but it was another for Shui Wuyin to be tormented. Shui Wuyin had been feeling like his days were dark and gloomy. Every day he saw Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan, it was as if he had seen the king of hell. Where did Yunyang go? What is this place? Why is this happening? Lock us up? What do you mean? Speak clearly. Why aren't you speaking, coffin face? Say something. I remember that you can speak. Speak quickly. Shui Wuyin had to be interrogated more than 30 times a day. Shui Wuyin was miserable. Yet he could not afford to offend either one of them. This was the most torturous thing. One was the sister of Supreme Wind whom Shui Wuyin respected the most in his life. The other was Supreme Wind's fiancée. Shui Wuyin wished that he could worship these 2 people like deities. How would he dare offend them? These were the relatives of the god in his heart. Two goddesses. In the end, Shui Wuyin finally confessed, speaking vaguely about some information. Actually, I'm doing this to protect the both of you. I know that the both of you are uncomfortable, but it's too dangerous out there. If you act rashly, you'll be putting yourselves in danger. Actually, the both of you are Supreme Win's fiancée and sister of Yutong's 9 Supremes. Towards the end, Shui Wuyin spoke vaguely of the news. It was as if the two ladies had heard a bolt from the blue. This heavy news made the two women dizzy, and their eyes and mouths almost became crooked. It was no wonder that they could not find their brother and fiancé. So this was the truth. However, wasn't this information a little too shocking? Their eldest brother, their fiancé, how did he become Supreme Wind? So brother is carrying such a heavy responsibility. If it was someone else, he would have been crushed to death. Jilingxi thought. So, he carries such a deep grudge with him? Yes, how could he only care about marrying me under such circumstances? He would feel sorry for his brothers as well? Yurulan thought to herself. After thinking that they understood their brothers' sweethearts' predicament, Jilingxi and Yurulan made a decision at the same time. Since Ji Lingfeng cared so much about the empire of Yutong and had dedicated his life to the country, to the 9 Supremes brothers, now that Yutong was in trouble and Supreme Wind was not around, the responsibility that belonged to him was also their responsibility. Of course they had to shoulder it. Since he's not here, we'll help him protect the country. Shui Wuyin had never thought that his words would make these two ladies want to join the army and serve the country. He tried his best to persuade her, but to no avail. The two ladies were resolute. Who could control these two ladies when Yin Yang was not here? Shui Wuyin could only think of a way to contact the Shangguan family of generals. Everyone knew that Shangguan Lingxiu was going to war. Only by following a female general would they feel more at ease. Old Mistress Shangguan was still fretting that Shangguan Lingxiu's personal guard's cultivation base was too low and that they might not be able to protect her granddaughter's safety on the battlefield. Yu Rulan and Ji Lingxi's cultivation base was not worth mentioning in the eyes of experts, but in the Tianshan continent, they were considered top-notch. So he immediately agreed. That very morning, banners fluttered in the wind as the army set out. When Qiu Jianhan led the army out of Tiantang City's east gate, he could clearly feel the worried gaze of his old wife who had been by his side all his life, watching him from the wall behind him. Qiu Jianhan steeled his heart and refused to turn back. The army was neat, mighty and majestic. In spite of this, Qiu Jianhan found it odd. In his entire life he had led an army into battle no less than 100 times, but this was the first time he had such a strange feeling. He didn't have the confidence he had in the past. It was snowing heavily. Qiu Jianhan howled, "Yutong is forever." 666 war drums and 666 trombones sounded at the same time. Qiu Jianhan laughed at the sky and rode away. His white beard fluttered in the wind and snow as his hearty laughter came from afar. This old man has gone to war hundreds and thousands of times in his life, but going to war in the snow is a different kind of feeling. Ah! Qiu Jianhan, leading the army, be it the veterans or the new recruits, was elated. Han Sanhe was the god of war, but Qiu Jianhan was also the empire of Yutong's invincible idol. The old marshal had not led an army into battle for more than a decade. Everyone was equally excited to see him go to war today. On top of the city wall, old Mistress Qiu lowered her gaze sadly. Old Mistress Qiu was inexplicably worried. Looking at her husband's majestic back as he walked further and further away in the snow, she could not help the tears welling in her eyes. It was as if the most important thing in her life had suddenly been lost. Her heart was filled with worry, an urge to follow the army into battle. They would be together in life and they would be together in death. In her palm was the letter her husband had left behind. It was a thick stack, but old mistress did not read it. She knew what was written in it. She would rather not open this letter for the rest of her life, until the day she died. When her husband came home last night and told her that he was going to war, she was visibly stunned. It was because the tiger-hoofed hurricane that had followed her husband for 17 years had suddenly fallen ill and died just yesterday morning. Her husband had 2 fine horses in his lifetime. When he was young, he had tamed the king of horses in the grassland, the tiger-hoofed hurricane. Since then he had never tasted defeat in the battlefield. Many years later, the old horse had retired, and the one he rode was the offspring of the tiger-hoofed hurricane. Now the second horse had died of illness as well. What a coincidence! It had died a day before her husband went to war. Old Mistress Qiu had a bad feeling about this. When her husband came home and received the news, he was silent for a long time. Then he dug a big hole with his physical strength and buried the horse. Then he held the wine pot and drank on the grave for half the night. Only then did he go to war. Just when she was sending her husband out in the wee hours of the morning, a sudden gust of wind blew and a brick fell from the gate and landed in front of her husband. Old Mistress Chiu had wanted to persuade her husband not to go to war this time. However, Chiu Jianhan had only glanced at the brick in front of him in silence before he left resolutely. He had said nothing. Old Mistress Chiu shuddered at the thought of it. However, there was no other way around it. It was the duty of a general to fight on the battlefield when the empire was in danger. How could he retreat just because of some strange little things before the war? The army had decided to go. How could he not go at this time? Come back soon, old Mistress Chiu's voice echoed in the snow. She spoke with utmost sincerity. Heaven, as long as old Chiu can return safely, I am willing to be a vegetarian for the rest of my life, to sink into the abyss of misery in my next life, in exchange for the last few years of this life. Heaven, please bless Lord Supreme Wind of Yutong to arrive at the battlefield soon. This old woman is willing to exchange the rest of my life for this. The same prayer was carried out in every family in the Empire of Yutong. Lord Supreme Cloud, whom all of Yutong had been looking forward to, was now burning with anxiety in the mountains. It had been 24 days. Yunyang was trapped in the forest under the snow. He could not move. In these days he had thought of countless ways. Mr. Nian, who was above him, had done the same. Now, the forest within 50,000 feet of him was completely scorched. The thick layer of snow was gone. Even the grass beneath the ground had lost all signs of life. The biggest rock was no bigger than a fingernail. From top to bottom, Mr. Nian had hacked at the ground, rocks, and trees no less than 10,000 times. It was said that one had to dig 3 feet into the ground, but this time Mr. Nian had not only dug 3 feet into the ground. He had dug 1,000 feet into the ground. Yunyang had been injured no less than 200 times in the process. Each time, he had to maintain a clear mind to shift within a small area. Only then could he avoid Mr. Nian's sword energy that was like a dragnet. He had come up with all sorts of methods. Mr. Nian might not be able to find his exact location, but it was hopeless for him to kill his way out of this cage. If he continued like this, the biggest possibility would be, until the end, Mr. Nian would not be able to find him, and he would truly turn into dust under the ground. There would not even be a corpse. After all, his soul was continuously injured. He was already feeling like he could no longer continue. Ever since he was trapped here, he had been hoping for an external force to intervene. As long as there was an external force, he would be able to seize the opportunity to escape. However, there had never been one. Occasionally there would be martial artists who passed by, but before they could even get close, Mr. Nian's sword light had shattered their souls and killed them from thousands of feet away. He was not even willing to let the spiritual energy of those who had died, which could cause confusion, into this space. Yunyang could only be furious, but he could not come up with a solution no matter how hard he racked his brain. There were so many experts in the martial world. The Concourse of the Underworld, the Four Seasons Tower, Jun Moyan, Longshao, and many more. Had none of those legendary figures passed by this place? Where had Lei Dongtian gone? Could that fellow be dead as well? Why was there no news of him? Although this place was remote, but, for the people of Jianghu, what place could be called remote? For the first 3 days Yunyang waited confidently, but to no avail. For the next 3 days Yunyang calculated. Even if it was a coincidence, someone should have passed by this place, but there was still no one. On the 8th day, a few fellows who came to pick herbs, they were all dead before they could even get close. On the 11th day, a few robbers came out of nowhere wanting to do business, but they were mercilessly killed by Mr. Nian on behalf of heaven. On the 16th day, another true expert passed by. Judging from the situation, he was at least a few levels above the heaven realm, but he too died outside the forest. These days, even the birds that flew in the sky were not spared. Not to mention the snakes and earthworms underground, even the ants were killed by Mr. Nian. Yunyang was speechless, encountering an opponent as persistent as Mr. Nian. Was the Four Seasons Tower so free? As the Four Seasons Tower's leader, shouldn't you go back and take charge of the situation? Why were you still hanging around here? When he was free, Mr. Nian would talk to himself like a chatterbox, using all sorts of malicious words to provoke Yunyang, wanting him to explode. In the beginning, Yunyang tried his best to restrain himself. However, in the end he could no longer restrain himself. He did not even have the strength to erupt. Mr. Nian was still hopping around on top, his sword energy raging like a storm. Within the time it took to finish a cup of tea, he had plowed through the entire area. Then he rested, chatterbox, stimulated, and after another cup of tea's time, he would suddenly plow through the area again. Yunyang even felt that he had turned into water. It was difficult for him to move agilely in this dry land. The 1,000 feet of soil was parched, like the surface of a desert that had been exposed to the sun for a year. How could a few drops of water move through it? If he was not careful, he might even be devoured by the soil directly. Yunyang was close to despair. Was Yunyang really going to die here this time? Just when Yunyang was almost in a daze, unable to move, his mind was a little fuzzy, and he was even thinking of giving up. The turning point had suddenly come. 2 chapters totaling up to 16,700. Everyone who read it chuckled. The author is beautiful and honest, Chidian is the most handsome. Chapter 463. This afternoon I wrote half of it. When my wife came over, I asked her to take a look. She gave a suggestion. She said, "You're doing this purely to help the main character get out of trouble. It's a little too deliberate. It's too much like the main character's halo." I thought about it and felt that it made sense. Although the main character's halo was definitely there, it couldn't be done so smoothly, hence, I discarded the manuscript and thought about it again. Let's see if we can take another path. Give me some time. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.